atomic gigantification was a sweeping Japan nation when along came a dude with an ultra attitude, a Kamen Rider who's the greatest kicker of Japan. And of all, man, life's too short now, baby, to not talk big now, baby. Conversation.
And welcome back to
Monster
Conversation,
Harryhausen Annual.
Nathan, it is once again that time of the year. It's been a whole year.
A whole year.
A whole year. Happy birthday, Nathan.
Happy birthday, Elijah. And happy birthday, Ray. We always have to start these episodes like this.
We have to. Happy birthday, Ray. That is the consistency that must stay consistent for till the end of time, or whatever this series.
Until we run out of Harryhausen movies.
Maybe, in the world of AI, maybe by the point that, we're to that point, people have AI'd Ray Harryhausen movies.
Oh, can we not?
We could talk about how horrible they are for an hour and a half.
Oh, yeah, we don't need to do that. But yes, welcome, Kaiju lovers, and I don't know, do you have a funny name for your listeners? I don't know.
Conversationalists.
Conversationalists, the Convies. No, wait, those are awards.
Yeah. The Converse.
No, the Converse. The Converse. I hear that's a good one.
I don't know. We make it up.
Yeah, we'll make it up. But anyway, welcome everyone. And if you're a Harryhausen fan, hello, my name is Nate Marchand, host of the Monster Island Film Vault podcast.
And I'm Elijah Thomas, one of the hosts of the Kaiju Conversation podcast. And I guess we probably should explain what Monster Conversation is for anybody who did not listen to the previous 3 entries of our show. This is a crossover event that occurs once a year on June 29th, the birthday of Ray Harryhausen, that just so happens to be the birthday of not only Ray, but Mr. Nathan Marchand and myself.
One Elijah Thomas. It was so funny when we discovered that. First off, we were just kind of excited because we're like, what? We're 2 Kaiju podcasters with the same birthday. And then I remembered, wait a minute. That's Ray Harryhausen's birthday. Go figure. That like the stars just all aligned. And I just got a hold of you, Elijah, and I said, dude, we need to start doing an annual crossover episode where we talk about a Harryhausen movie together and then put it out on both of our podcast feeds on June 29th.
And I said, let's do it. And then the discussion became, how do we decide what we're doing? Now, Nathan, you yourself have previously done Mighty Joe Young, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and 20 Million Miles to Earth on your own show. And as for our show, Kaiju Conversation, Rex and I's, we hadn't touched a Ray Harryhausen title yet. So it was difficult to say, let's start at the beginning, because the beginning had already been done by you. We couldn't do that again. Which, as a quick preface and an aside, Kaiju Conversation will be putting out its first Ray Harryhausen episode very soon. It'll either be slightly before or slightly after the release of this one. We will be covering Mighty Joe Young. So that, I just wanted to throw that out there as some shameless self-promotion.
Oh, we like that around here.
We love that. But you said, well, I've done those. We can't do them again. I said, you're right. And Nathan, you have reminded me of how we came to decide how we did this series. And could you remind the audience how that happened?
It was during a late night phone conversation back in your "Hi, my name is Elijah" era. And you said, let's go backwards. And I said,
Maybe-
okay, we're going backwards.
I wonder if I had just like rewatched Ready Player One, because the whole thing, like the first key in that movie is you have to go backwards in the race to get the key. I don't know. Like it was some sort of big brain, sleepy, tired Elijah thing, I guess. But yeah, no, we are going backwards. So the first episode of Monster Conversation Harryhausen Annual was on Clash of the Titans, followed by Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger.
Eye of the Tiger! The one episode you got a copyright claim on because I tried throwing in I thought it would be safe. It was a karaoke track for Eye of the Tiger, and YouTube still decided to be an a-hole about it. I'm sorry.
And then we did The Golden Voyage of Sinbad last year.
Sinbad. Yep.
And so we are continuing on in our trail of Ray Harryhausen titles. And this year, you know, Nathan, on my show, I always have a really bad problem with forgetting what we're talking about.
Yeah, you do.
And I'm sorry, but it's slipped my mind. So can you introduce myself and the listeners to what we're talking about?
Yeah. It takes place in a large expanse of empty land. It's usually between two higher pieces of land, like hills and mountains. And there's all of these terrible lizards that supposedly have names derived from Native American words.
Are you talking about the big space of giant lizard monsters?
Close. Might want to consult the really overlooked dinosaur of the Fosaurus. I know, it's a terrible joke. It's a terrible joke. Yeah, we're going to go with that one. We're going with that one. Welcome to MIFV, people. No, it is Valley of... Can you finish it? Gwangi! Yes! 1969. Ray Harryhausen's third and final dinosaur movie.
Now, this is following 1 million years BC, and were they counting the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms?
I believe so. When I was doing my research, and I think Ray, in his own book, An Animated Life, said this was my third dinosaur movie, and I'm thinking, it's like, what were the other ones? 1 million years BC, and I guess Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Those are the ones I can think of.
The only other thing is maybe they're counting the Animal World in 1956, like Doc he did.
Mm-hmm.
Because he did animate dinosaurs for that, so perhaps that's what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
The Rhedosaurus is a dinosaur, but it's a fictional dinosaur. So I don't know. I don't know what the classifications here is. But before
he was offered to do the animation for the sequels to 1 million years BC, but he turned it down. And I think he turned down the first one, which, if I remember correctly, was When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, so he can make this.
Right. Now, he made this for a very specific reason. So I think now, before we really talk about the film itself, we need to go back in time about 25 years.
Yes.
If you are willing to indulge me on this.
No, not at all. Well, yes, I shouldn't say no, not at all, but yes, let's talk about this, because the origin of this film might actually be a bit more interesting than the movie itself, aside from the special effects, which are fantastic. But I don't want to telegraph that too much.
Yeah. So the whole reason that Ray Harryhausen did this film is, I guess he said he was in his garage. And he was going through stuff, and he just stumbled upon a script written by his mentor and good friend Willis O'Brien, titled Valley of the Mists. It was an idea that started in 1941. But I think before we really talk about this, I don't know if you know about this, but there's even stuff that happens before this that kind of eventually birthed Gwangi. It's directly following Son of Kong And if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of dive into that a little bit to kind of put the pieces together.
Oh, go for it, because I'm starting to think you might have stumbled upon some things that I didn't find. So let's hear it.
Yeah, so following King Kong, obviously, so I guess I talked about this on our Mighty Joe Young episode, so I think it's kind of perfect that both of these episodes are coming out around the same time. So obviously, Willis O'Brien did The Lost World, and it did very well.
1925.
1925, and then he pitched,
100 years. This is the movie's 100th anniversary. That's wild.
It's wild, yeah. So following that, he would create some test footage for a film called Creation that RKO would eventually turn down due to a lack of public interest. And that was just a lack of interest on the company side, not public interest. So then came Marion C. Cooper, Ernest B. Chodazek's King Kong that O'Brien worked on, and then RKO quickly wanted the sequel, so Son of Kong was produced.
Okay, so like those parts I've talked about in other episodes of my show. But yeah.
So after Son of Kong, they wanted to continue on the King Kong idea, right? They were exploring various ideas that we're not going to dive into, but Marion C. Cooper wanted to do it, and Willis O'Brien wanted to do it. And so they were trying to figure out what to do. Various ideas came up, eventually that would help create King Kong versus Godzilla, but that's another story.
Yes. Oh boy, that Obi got done dirty with that, unfortunately.
But before Gwangi, there was a movie that Marion C. Cooper and Willis O'Brien were working on. Cooper was the producer, Willis O'Brien was creating the effects. It was titled War Eagles.
Yes.
And so the synopsis for War Eagles is, just prior to the start of World War II, a publicly humiliated Army Air Corps test pilot, court-martialed and discharged from the service for an unauthorized flight that ultimately endangered the life of President Roosevelt, takes the only job he can get, flying an experimental airplane around the world from pole to pole. When his plane is unexpectedly attacked and crashes on an uncharted island above the Arctic Circle, the pilot discovers a strange land inhabited by dinosaurs and a lost tribe of Norsemen who ride giant eagles. In a surprising turn of events, he learned that the Nazis are about to launch an attack of New York with an air fleet of Zeppelins and a powerful new electromagnetic weapon. Convincing his newfound allies to help him, the pilot leads an army of eagle-riding Vikings against the Nazis in the skies above New York. This project was in pre-production. There was test footage, stop motion being done, storyboards were done, and the script was done. Ray actually met Willis O'Brien for the first time while he was working on War Eagles. So this was kind of the beginning of Ray and Willis O'Brien's very rich career that the two would be intertwined with until Willis O'Brien passed away in 1962.
And it's doubly appropriate because Harryhausen saw King Kong as a child.
Right.
And it was a huge inspiration for him to become a special effects artist.
Right. So War Eagles was wrote by Cyril Hume, who wrote the film The Great Gatsby, Forbidden Planet, and The Invisible Boy. And as the film was moving towards production, various things happened. World War II was becoming a bigger thing. Marion C. Cooper joined in the war. And then eventually, RKO just said that the film probably wouldn't work. It was a very popular thing to avoid making war films against the Nazis at the time, I guess, due to a concern of losing out on that market. That's kind of what I read. So they decided it was too much of a hot topic, really, to produce such a film. And so following War Eagles, that's when Willis O'Brien would start developing the Valley of Gwangi. Now, it's important to note that the Valley of Gwangi was being developed before Mighty Joe Young. The film was influenced by The Lost World, which the initial script, Valley of the Mists, was influenced by The Lost World, which, as we previously established, Willis O'Brien worked on. And RKO was the company set to produce the film by 1942. There were 3D dioramas constructed along with some concept art, but the film was eventually canceled due to a lack of public interest. Now, obviously, Westerns were popular. Dinosaurs, like the idea of an adventure film. Willis O'Brien was constantly trying to recapture the amazing phenomenon that King Kong was.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, Mighty Joe Young had John Ford attached, and John Ford is very well known for his Westerns.
Yes.
And so now John Ford wasn't attached by the time production had started in 1947. So he was more so attached to the film in 1946 than anything prior. Ray Harryhausen and Willis O'Brien were working together on the early stages of Mighty Joe Young, pitching story ideas and concepts in meetings. Mm-hmm. That was occurring in 1946. Now, 1942 was when Gwangi was officially at RKO, and then, of course, RKO would eventually create Mighty Joe Young. And if you really look at these two films, they are very much blood relatives. The story for Mighty Joe is basically Gwangi and King Kong together.
Yeah, actually, I'm trying to see where I had this in my notes, but it was actually described by somebody as Mighty Joe Young as a Western.
Right. Now, Gwangi in the original script was supposed to fight lions, and that would eventually
it was one of the actors, Franciscus. He said it was a Western version of Mighty Joe Young.
Gotcha. So it's very interesting to note that Gwangi was supposed to fight lions initially, because that eventually would go to Mighty Joe Young.
It did.
And that's why it would change for Gwangi to an elephant, which is more in line with like 20 million miles to Earth. Something more closer to Ray Harryhausen.
Yeah, we'll get into it, but there are certain points where, as I was rewatching this, I said, oh, that ended up in Mighty Joe Young, and Ray himself admitted, yeah, I got this from Mighty Joe Young and used it again here.
Now, what's really interesting is there are reports that in 1949, a film titled Valley of the Mists, with some of the people that were at RKO and whatnot, was slated to, and Willis O'Brien was attached to it, was supposed to start filming. Now, what's important to note is 1949 is the year that Mighty Joe Young came out, right? Hold on one second. 1949. Yes. Now, what's important to note is Mighty Joe Young failed at the box office. Mighty Joe Young did not do well. It ended up being the 51st highest grossing film for RKO that year. It was the 51st film at the all-time box office for that year. It was the 5th highest grossing film for RKO, and it was supposed to be another King Kong. And once you notate just how poorly it did, it ended up losing money. So what I'm going to assume is what happened is Mighty Joe Young underperformed, and because of Mighty Joe Young underperforming, Valley of the Mists ended up getting the can. The film was supposed to be shot in Central America. Jesse L. Lasky was producing. Richard Landau was writing the script. He worked on films such as The Quartermass Experiment, Pharaoh's Curse, Voodoo Island, Frankenstein 1970, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, The Incredible Hulk, The Black Hole, and Beyond Westworld. So what probably happened is while Mighty Joe Young was the more favored title, the film did not do well. And because it didn't do well, Gwangi had no chance to work. At least that's probably what RKO was assuming. And so it would sit. Now, Willis O'Brien did make a movie in 1956. It was 1965, called The Beast from Hollowed Mountain.
Beast from Hollow Mountain, yes.
Yes. And that follows the exact same premise that Gwangi is. I'm going to assume that he probably had some input there. He did have input there. So he got to make the film, but not in stop motion.
It was 1956.
1956. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
So O'Brien eventually got to do the title or the film, but not in the way that he envisioned or wanted. And so after O'Brien passed away, Harryhausen, found the Gwangi script in his garage, and he teamed up again with Charles Schneer.
Yeah.
And he worked with Harryhausen on virtually almost all of his films.
Yeah, he worked with him a lot. We've talked about Mr. Schneer before in our previous coverage. Now, something that I read in Harryhausen's book is that, yes, Harryhausen rediscovered this stuff, but he said that there was a point where Obi showed him dioramas, production sketches, and continuity drawings for a project called Gwangi, which, and I haven't been able to confirm this because it didn't get very specific, but Obi claimed, according to Ray, that Gwangi was a Native American word for lizard. Wish he had been more specific about which tribe had this word, supposedly. And one of the things that Ray said that he remembers seeing was a picture of cowboys lassoing a dinosaur, and he loved it. And it said that those sketches inspired a scene in Mighty Joe Young where you have cowboys trying to lasso Joe, who's a gorilla. And then you see a very similar scene in Gwangi, which we'll get into. And then, yes, he rediscovered it years later.
And so when they were beginning development on Gwangi again in the 60s, it would get rewritten by William Bast, who worked on The Outer Limits and a movie called Deadly Invasion, The Killer Bee Nightmare. And the film was, the reason they picked Gwangi over War Eagles, because Ray had both. And obviously, like, War Eagles was kind of a closer film for him because he met Willis O'Brien while they were working on that. They ended up deciding that War Eagles, because of the World War II time setting, it probably wouldn't work as well as Gwangi. And
which is interesting because the original Gwangi script did take place in the 40s.
Yeah. And so it's very interesting. They ended up taking Gwangi back to the 1900s.
The turn of the century.
Which is even more like, farther back. I presume the reason was just simply because World War II by the mid-60s was probably either a unfavorable topic, a not popular topic, or overshadowed by the Cold War.
Probably, but war movies were particularly popular. Were still popular, I should say, in the 60s. Not as much by the time you got to the late 60s, but they were still a thing.
Right. It very well could have also just been simply or included, like it could be a mixture of these.
That could have been. But it's interesting. What you were saying?
I was just going to say perhaps Ray just felt closer to Gwangi because of like Mighty Joe with their very clear like lineage bloodline and their scripting.
Perhaps. But it's interesting that they made the choice to make it be, basically about 1900, turn of the century, because historically speaking, that's kind of slightly after the cowboy era. The actual cowboy era in American history was remarkably short. But it became so iconic in American culture, but it was really only about 25, 30 years, but basically the end of the Civil War to about the 1890s was the prime cowboy era. So the fact this is 1900, like I said, is a little bit after that. Things are shifting in a different direction culturally and historically.
And so I guess once they had decided, now the producer, he primarily worked on a lot of specifically the Columbia films. Now, Ray had worked on Mighty Joe Young, which was a Warner Brothers title, and then he would go on to do Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, again, Warner Brothers. And then around that time, that's whenever we started to see him work with Columbia.
Mhm.
So It Came From Beneath the Sea was 1955, I believe. And then you had in 1956 The Animal World, which was, again, Warner Brothers. But after this, he really just went straight over to Columbia.
It Came From Beneath the Sea was 1955.
55? Okay.
Mhm.
55, and then Animal World was 56. And then in 57, you had Earth versus the Flying Saucers. And then 20 Million Miles to Earth, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, The Three Worlds of Gulliver, Mysterious Island, Jason and the Argonauts, First Men in the Moon, and then Gwangi was the title following this. Now, in 1965, he did 1 million years BC.
I'll look that up here. Keep going.
So, besides 1 million years BC, for the most part, Ray had split most his work in the 50s specifically between Warner Brothers and Columbia. But by the time that Gwangi was in development actively, Ray was primarily just working with Columbia. He would return to Warner Brothers in 1981 for
which one was I looking up? 1 million
1
years
million
BC?
years.
1966.
1966, okay. So besides 1 million years BC, which was a Hammer production, Ray had basically established himself as a Columbia Pictures associated filmmaker.
Mhm.
Because outside of his early work with Mighty Joe Beast and Animal World, everything else was Columbia, and then he did 1 million years BC. And he went back to Columbia and pitched Gwangi, but Columbia didn't want it. They ended up turning it down. And so that's how it ended up at Warner Brothers. And this would be one of his last films for them. After this, of course, he would do Clash of the Titans, like I previously said. But he would return to Columbia for 1969. Is it Golden Voyage 69?
Golden Voyage is 73.
73, and then Eye of the Tigers
77.
77. So he would return to Columbia for that Sinbad duology, and he was actively working on Sinbad films all throughout the 70s, which we really talk about in, I think it's the last episode we did. I think that's where we really honed in on it. But it's kind of interesting to see Gwangi in that context of this was a random Warner Brothers title. Same with 1 million years BC, which I'm sure there's an explanation for that we'll get whenever we tackle that film.
Oh, that'll be next year, actually.
Yeah. So next year we'll really dive into that one. But it is interesting to see Ray jumping, or Columbia specifically jumping from Ray pushing Ray away and him having to jump to Warner to produce this title, especially considering his producer, who had worked with him on virtually all of his Columbia titles, specifically not, being able to make it happen there. The only title that Sheener worked on that wasn't Schneer didn't work on that was Ray Harryhausen and Columbia was Clash of the Titans. That's the only one outside of Gwangi. Gwangi and Titans was it. Everything else was, in fact, through Columbia Pictures.
Yeah. But you mentioned Valley of the Mist. That the basic concept that I found for that one is that it's supposed to be cowboys find an Allosaurus in the Grand Canyon. So it was, in the original draft, it was set in America, not Mexico. But after that, you mentioned fighting lions, but it's very similar from what I see after that. It was supposed to be a Technicolor co-production with RKO and Colonial Pictures.
Okay.
And then after 6 months and $50,000, they abandoned it, either because of cost or the war, like you said.
It's important to note that Mighty Joe was also supposed to be in Technicolor, but due to budgetary reasons, they couldn't do that. So it's very obvious that they were trying to actively make a color stop-motion film in the 40s with O'Brien.
Marcel Delgado, who's produced probably the most iconic images of dinosaurs ever. He also did designs for King Kong 1933. He constructed prototypes of Gwangi, and Mario Larinaga painted several matte paintings for it, and they did build a few miniature sets. And keep in mind, this is the original version that O'Brien was trying to do. And then the next issue that they ran into was legal issues over who owned RKO, because Howard Hughes sold RKO to General Tire in 1955. Yes, a tire company for a hot second owned King Kong, among other things. And then, besides that, you had producer John Speaks and a novelist named Harold Lamb and Emily Barrie, who were also involved with the project at the time. Do we want to jump to when Ray rediscovered this?
Yeah, let's do
25
it.
years later, because that's where my notes go next.
Let's do it.
All right. So he was rummaging through some stuff, found the script, reread it, thought it was good, and even though he did think it was a little bit slow for quote-unquote modern audiences, so he gave it to Schneer, and that's when they hired William Bast and Julian Moore to develop it into a new script. And the working title was The Valley Where Time Stood Still. It was changed because the studio and Franciscus, who's one of the actors, thought it was too long and complicated.
There's also a couple other titles that were reported in the trades.
Mm-hmm.
The two titles I found were The Valley Time Forgot and The Lost Valley. Those were when the film was in production, which it was shot in July of 1967, specifically July 8th is the production start date, and then it filmed through October of 1967. It wasn't supposed to go that long, but there were various production issues that eventually led to the film being delayed in terms of completion.
Yeah. Here's something that I thought was funny, and I got this from Ray's book. He said the name Gwangi, even though that's the title that they settled on, the Valley of Gwangi, he said that the people who were working on it associated the name Gwangi with Japanese kaiju films.
See, I was personally thinking that, like, the title Gwangi, like, besides the Gwa, everything else in Gwangi is very much like you could put that as a Japanese katakana character. G, N, and A. Even Gwa, or Gwa, you could probably find a way to do that.
That just made me laugh. Although, I'm going to be honest with you, Ray's opinions on Japanese films seems to be a bit inconsistent. Sometimes he says he really doesn't like them, and then I've seen him speak highly of them. So
let's dive into that a little bit, because I mean that's a can of worms we would eventually have to cover anyway. So obviously, the narrative in the fandom of kaiju films is Willis O'Brien was already in poor health whenever he was working with John Beck on King Kong versus Frankenstein or King Kong versus Prometheus. And then John Beck was supposed to kind of be a broker of sorts, but he ended up just taking the script and essentially, I guess there was a miscommunication, and Willis O'Brien lost the rights to it. And so when John Beck sold it to Toho, and Toho reworked it to King Kong versus Godzilla, and O'Brien found out, the narrative goes that that was like the last straw, and it shocked Willis O'Brien, and after that, that's when his health went from not good to horrible, and he his health deteriorated fast after that. And Ray Harryhausen basically witnessed not only his mentor and good friend and co-worker, but the person who basically gave him his introduction into the world of special effects and filmmaking whenever, Harryhausen saw King Kong back in 1933. And so the narrative goes that because of that, Ray Harryhausen blamed Godzilla for killing Willis O'Brien, and that the Japanese films were inferior in technologically to that of stop motion and what Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen was doing at the time. So that's the narrative that is, I think, generally accepted in the kaiju fandom.
But like I said, I've seen some interviews with him. It was retired Ray, much later in his life, where he said nice things about Japanese kaiju movies.
Do you know kind of like roughly what he did say, just for sake of...
It was very brief. The one that I saw, I believe it was while I was doing my research for 20 Million Miles to Earth. I was going over the special features on that Blu-ray, and he just very quickly said that he thought the Japanese films were good, and then went on to talk about whatever else he was being interviewed about at the time for 20 Million Miles.
That does make me...
That's a little different than what I normally hear him say, or hear people say how he felt.
That does make me wonder, like you did clarify it's retired Ray, so that makes me really wonder if the time that went past following O'Brien's death and the decades after, especially after Ray finished like his career in filmmaking and went to, just doing interviews and a couple cameo roles in various movies and whatnot.
Working on some of the remasters of his movies.
Right. I do wonder if somewhere in all of that he found a newfound appreciation for the work that they were doing. Perhaps he just kind of learned more. Maybe, I don't know if it's documented, maybe he met Haruo Nakajima, because I know they've had Nakajima sit with the original King Kong stop motion model. So I don't know if that was when Ray was in possession of it, because I'm pretty sure Ray possessed one of those. But if maybe that was something to do with it, maybe he just learned, realized, oh, these guys didn't they weren't doing this to just kind of cheaply remake what I was doing. They're genuine with what they were doing. I don't know, but it's definitely interesting to know that, Ray, at least later on in life, didn't hold the grudge that many people believe he did for Godzilla and his contemporaries.
Yeah. So, yeah, got the ball rolling with that. And that you mentioned the time frame. Well, I should mention this. So Ray wanted Obi's name to be included for obvious reasons, but only Bast was credited as the screenwriter, despite the fact that there were other people involved in making the script. He thinks, this is from his book, that it was because of legal reasons that kept his name out, but he also thinks they would have needed permission from Obi's widow, Darlene, and she may have, he thinks that even if they did ask, she may have not given permission because she would have felt like they were trying to cash in on her husband's name at that point, which I can understand, despite the good intentions. Obviously.
Right. Especially if Ray feels that way, it's I'm sure Ray Harryhausen knew Willis O'Brien's wife. I'm sure that was something that it would have been I'm going to see an old friend. And if he was worried about something like that, I'm sure there was legitimate, this is probably what will happen. So that makes sense.
And as you mentioned, this was originally supposed to be made by Columbia, but they thought it was too expensive. And then the Kenneth Hyman, who was the co-producer on 1 Million Years BC, put Harryhausen in touch with Hyman's father, Elliot, who just bought Warner Brothers, and that's when they negotiated a deal. Because this is I looked this up. This is a weird little kind of one-off studio that was part of Warner Brothers, a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, that only existed for a couple of years. It's reminded me a little bit of Toho Eizo in the 70s with Toho, where it's this weird little subsidiary within Toho. But like I said, I think actually not long, if I remember correctly, not long after Gwangi was released, this thing didn't even exist anymore.
That makes sense based off of the issues at Warner Brothers at the time.
Yeah. They filmed this in Almeria and Cuenca in Spain. And the interiors were filmed in a TV studio in Madrid. Ciudad Encantada's strange rock formations were used for the valley. Let's see, Tabernas in the Iberian Peninsula was the plateau outside the valley, and the Tabernas village was the location for the Mexican town. And they also used, for the bull rings, they used locations in Colmenar and Almeria, as well as Las Dunas de Cabo de Gata and the Cathedral of Cuenca. And they said that the shooting schedule was very tight and was overseen by Schneer. And that often annoyed Ray because he was a perfectionist. And sometimes he just had to make do, as he put it. But he also admits that most audiences don't notice, the things that he was a little disappointed with.
That makes sense. I feel like this is probably one of Ray's rougher films, just on a technical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will say this: they used both life-size models and stop-motion miniatures in this film, and the intercut between those two isn't actually that bad. I think it's actually pretty seamless.
Yep. And you mentioned when Ray got started on his animation, it was, according to him, specifically October 17th, 1967. He did it in his own little studio at Shepperton Studios, which was in the parking lot. Go figure on that. He says that's also where he filmed the effects for Mysterious Island and Jason and the Argonauts.
Now, I read that it took almost a year to film the special effects scenes.
He finished October 7th, 1968. So 1 week short of a year.
And there was roughly 300 of Dynamation, as it was labeled. 400, gotcha.
400 stop-motion cuts. He also said that where he was filming it, he had a projection tunnel with a quote-unquote longer throw on his projector.
And this is also the last film that was labeled as Dynamation.
Yes, they changed that after this. And I said there was 400 stop-motion cuts. That was more than any other film up to that point.
Which is interesting because this film has, I would say, considerably less effects than the previous films, such as like Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Because realistically, it's the Stegosaur, the Allosaur / T-Rex, whichever way you want to call it, the pterodactyl, and the miniature horse, and the elephant. So there's 5 creatures, stop motions.
Yeah, there's some other things that are more specific to the, to what we're going to see in the movie as we go through it, as you always do on your show. But one thing I'll mention about, about the church where they filmed, the church was being restored at the time. And so in order to be able to film there and make the authorities happy, they had to tell them, we're going to film a Hollywood movie here. It'll make the place famous. And then they had to offer a quote unquote contribution to the restoration.
Contribution.
That's what it says.
Money laundering.
Maybe. The movie, we will talk. Do you want to talk about the release of the movie?
Well, I mean, I'll just say this. It was released June 11th, 1969. That was specifically the world premiere in Detroit. And then September 3rd in New York. And then the rollout followed that. It was released by Warner Brothers. I think it's best to leave what happened following its release to after we go through the movie. But I do think it's important to note now that the director of this film, his name is Jim O'Connelly, lost interest about halfway through filming, and he just was there to get the paycheck and move on.
Yeah, I found some very different opinions about how people felt about the director.
From what I read, it was generally negative.
Yeah, I'm trying to find my note about that. Schneer didn't like him, but James Franciscus, he actually liked the guy. Bass, I should say, the screenwriter, said he was monumentally stupid because he was tampering with the script from the get-go. But Franciscus said that he had a nice sense of humor and was a happy sort of chap. He said O'Connelly made him redo some of the readings, but he said he was funny, he was being funny and charming about it. And Schneer didn't like him. Said he just didn't have his heart in it.
Which I think explains a lot about this movie. I'll say that before we really get into it. I think notating that he was not very, how do you say, invested.
Yeah.
Not very invested in the film. I think you can really tell in the film at various points.
Yeah.
Which we'll dive into.
Yeah, we'll dive into. And I stand corrected. I need to issue a retraction. Charles Knight is the iconic dinosaur designer, not Delgado. And Charles Knight's concept of a T-Rex was heavily influential on the design of Gwangi in this movie.
So, if you are ready, Nathan, we can kind of transition here into actually talking about the film. I know we've kind of brought up a couple of our opinions, nothing too crazy.
Yeah.
But
all I will say really quickly to finish up the context for this is Schneer and Ray wanted to cash in on the resurgence of popularity of dinosaurs, which is what led to this, besides doing this as a tribute to Obi. But it should also be noted that even though on paper this sounds like a great idea, it's what we would term a weird Western, which is where you have a Western, but then you throw in some fantastical elements into it. Cowboys and aliens would be an example of that.
Right.
So it sounds like a great idea. Dinosaurs and cowboys, that's great. Well, the issue that you're running into is this is 1969 when it comes out. Westerns were not nearly as popular as they were. They hit their peaks really in probably the 50s. By the 60s, they were still getting made, but they were very different animals. They were being done more subversively. Most notably, you have the Man with No Name trilogy, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, being the most famous entry in that set with Clint Eastwood. That is almost a deconstruction of Westerns. But then you have stuff like The Magnificent Seven, which is kind of a weird balance point between those spaghetti Westerns and the old-fashioned Westerns. It's not quite as cynical, but, they had run their course at this point, which is why it's interesting. Before we started recording, we were talking about superhero movies and how there have been people have been saying for several years now that the superhero movie, I think Spielberg famously put this out, that superhero movies are going to go the way of the Western. They won't go away entirely, but they won't be nearly as popular as they used to and won't get made nearly as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's definitely what was. This is the maybe not well past, but this is past the prime era of the Western.
Right. I think it's really important to note that by 1969, if we're talking, because this is a science fiction film.
Yeah.
It's a Western science fiction film. Adventure, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
But by 1969, if you're talking in the context of what science fiction is, the previous year in 1968, you had 2001: A Space Odyssey, which completely reimagined and reshuffled the entirety of what science fiction cinema was.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also a monster movie. And by 1969 in the United States and even in Japan at this point, at least in the movie theater, monster movies were not nearly as popular either. So you've got Ray Harryhausen, this visionary, working on a movie that is primarily two genres that are not nearly as popular as they used to be.
Right.
That is definitely working against it.
It's definitely a recipe for disappointment.
Yeah.
And I think it's also like, by this point, I mean, a couple other films that were popular, Planet of the Apes.
Yep.
That was 1967. 1967? Right?
I believe so, but it might be 68. I will look that up.
But Planet of the Apes, and then, of course, there were sequels that were following that, was a social commentary on the
68.
68. Okay. So that came out a year prior to Gwangi. That was a commentary on the social issues of going on that was in America at the time with civil rights and whatnot, racism and whatnot. So that's like a great example of like stuff that was going on that
and the first sequel was the year after this,
right? Yeah. So you had stuff like that. There was a lot of like The Green Slime was a co-production between Toei and Ram Films and MGM. But you also had movies like Moon 02 and like Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women and whatnot. There was a lot of space films by this point, even in the context of kaiju films. If we're bringing it back to what I think you and I really feel comfy in. 1965, you had Astro Monster, Invasion of Astro Monster, and then nothing really space related in 66. But you did have Ultraman, and Ultraman was somewhat space related. And then in 1967, you had the X from Outer Space. You had Ultra 7. You had Ambassador Magma was in 1966 as well, which was space related. You had in 1968, you had Destroy All Monsters. You had The Green Slime. You had Gamera versus Viras. 1969 saw Gamera versus Guiron, and
which might be the most space related out of the Gamera movies. Yeah,
and so but that was stuff that was becoming really popular. Even look at Astro Monsters U.S. release,
1970
as Monster. Yeah, 1970. By 1968. And Planet of the Apes, Nathan, that is a movie about going into space. It is a space-based movie.
It should also be noted, since we're talking about space, this movie's premiere in Detroit was 1 month before the moon landing.
Interesting. And the moon landing's a whole nother thing. The space race was popular as well. All of that to say, the idea of a science fiction film that wasn't space related wasn't necessarily on the popular side.
No,
it kind of was setting up a disappointment.
And we should also bring up, and you and I have talked about this in years past, since we started at the end of Ray's career. This last decade or so of his career, these last handful of movies, it seemed like Ray was not necessarily chasing what was popular. He was still making these old-fashioned adventure movies.
Yes. That's something I also felt, and I'm really happy you brought that up, Nathan, because this film does feel like a 1950s.
Oh, it does.
Dinosaur on the loose,
It very much feels like this should have been made in the 40s or 50s.
Right.
This would have been a great companion piece to A Mighty Joe Young.
So my personal take, and I think, we'll find out if I'm right or wrong next year. This will be the last movie where you and I say this feels like Ray is past his years of relevancy in terms of technologically how it looks. And that's not to say it looks bad, right? The Valley of Gwangi is not a bad looking film.
No. When I found out what they did to achieve the effects in this movie, I was just blown away. But
that being said, it is undoubtedly a film of its time, and that's not to be negative. That is the style. This look is what we would attribute to a 1950s or early to mid 60s monster movie, not a late 60s and 70s film. And I believe that this will be the last time that you and I both say that, because after this, we're covering 1 million years BC, which is 1966.
66.
Which is more akin to what I think these films feel like.
And then after that, we will be getting to, I'm going to double check here, but I think that
First Men in the
Moon, which is very much going to be a space movie. It's very much a pre-moon landing sort of a space movie. And,
then you
also
have
an
Jason
and
and the
also an
Argonauts.
H.G. Is it H.G. Wells?
Yes.
Or yeah, it's an H.G. Wells adaptation, so I'll have to make sure I read the book before we get to that one. But we're really going to peak after that in a couple of years with Jason and the Argonauts.
Mm-hmm.
Probably his most iconic movie.
All of this to say, like, this movie, it is the last of its kind for us to cover. It was the beginning of what would become kind of, I think, the staple of Ray's later films, and that's it was made a couple years too late.
Yeah. Ray even said that he thought that this movie should have been released 5 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure, I don't recall the numbers on Clash or Golden, but I'm pretty sure the box office numbers were consistently just not coming in for these types of movies.
Let's see. I'm going to check really quick. Clash was pretty successful. It said that it had, according to Wikipedia anyway, its budget was between 9 and 15 million and it made 70.
Okay. So, that's good to know. But also that was a couple years of, not really producing something. So it kind of makes sense that would be the thing. And I do want to say, I'm not trying to make it out that stop motion is a old-fashioned, out-of-date type of special effect. I think films like The Terminator and RoboCop prove that it still works.
Yeah. Because you and I talked about this, because there's kind of different eras of these, we'll say, this style of special effects. It started with Willis O'Brien. Ray Harryhausen inherited that mantle, perfected it, and then after Ray was the Phil Tippett and Stan Winston era, I would say, which is what we have in the 80s to the early 90s, arguably for a little while after the 90s, but Jurassic Park changed everything with CGI after that. And Phil Tippett did work on that. It was originally supposed to be stop motion. But then ILM showed Steven Spielberg the CGI dinosaurs, and he's just like, we're going with that. But then he at least, didn't kick Phil out. They CGI'd over Tippett's models, which I think is why the CGI in Jurassic Park has aged as well as it has.
I think it's important to note that Gwangi inspired Jurassic Park, and we have the filmmakers that worked on JP, specifically the effects guys, who say that.
Yes, which we will be getting into. But with that, I think it's now a good time to get into this. I've got some other details related to the film that we'll get into. I do want to mention just really quick, I had the privilege several years ago of catching most of this movie. I did get there a little late, but I caught most of this movie at a Pickwick screening at G-Fest.
You were at the G-Fest screening, I presume.
Yes.
Well, that sounds like fun.
It was pretty fun. I wish I wasn't late getting there, but I did get to see it. Just thought I'd bring that up.
I have one on that topic, but I'll bring that up towards the end here.
Okay.
So,
the only other thing I'll mention is that this movie is basically just King Kong.
Yeah.
But with very different clothes. You'll see that as we go through. So we can go into this beat by beat like you normally do, or you can do your funny little synopsis, because I always enjoy your funny little synopses for these movies.
Well, what do you want me to do, Nathan? This is a combination of both of our shows.
Do your funny little synopsis, because that's just been a tradition for these. Probably should have had you do it before we got into all the nitty gritty of it. But, ever since you started talking about children being yeeted into the ocean in Clash of the Titans, I'm just like, I got to have you do this every year now.
In a world shot at daytime, but it looks like night. Many, many moons ago, a group of people were wandering. Not Dion the Wanderer. They were just looking around. For what? Nobody knows. But there was an old cranky woman. This cranky woman not only couldn't get laid, unless you think she's in with the shorter person in the film, but she can't see. but she still walks perfectly fine for the most part. It depends on how she's feeling. She tells Carlos, a man of wonder, that his brother died because he violated some sort of code. But in all reality, she's just cranky because menopause is real. Fast forward to some colorful names and title cards. We get the Valley of Gwangi. A man looking too dapper for his own good meets a boy and insults the boy, telling him that his father is probably sitting at home doing nothing. And just like my father, that kid's father's not there. He helps the man out, the little boy, for payment, only to discover his lover from another time and an old cranky man. There's a lot of old cranky people in this movie. Perhaps that says something about the people who are working on it. In this very boring rodeo, we see a woman who is dressed to be in a Sinbad movie, but acts like she's in a drama. Or a romance, who knows. She jumps with her horse into a vat of water, and then she gets out, dry as a bone. That's more mysterious than the old woman who can't see. We then find out that the man dressed more dapper than he should be for his own good is here to try and pick up TJ, the woman who's dry and not wet whatsoever, until a couple scenes later. He tries to get her to sell out and go join Buffalo Bill's wild circus. Buffalo Bill is nowhere to be found. He ends up getting shut out and kicked out, only to ride with the little boy out of town, where a man who probably could be Dr. Emmett Brown from another time period is there and cannot find his horse, because of course. Eventually they go back to his hut in a not Tremors movie. He explains about tiny horses and rocks. The man dressed more dapper than for his own good could care less. As the man dapper, as I'm going to call him going forward, leaves this Dr. Emmett Brown fat dude, he returns to watch a new act with a bull. The boy who has no father, as myself, decides to go out and play with the bull. Why? Who knows? He's kind of stupid. Probably because he had no father. Suddenly, TJ is wet for the man whom she knew as Jack Kirby. Tuck Kirby. Jack Kirby's a writer.
I was going to say, that's a comic book artist.
It's okay. He could be a comic book artist of his own. The two make love, and then she shows him a miniature horse. Because of course. Following this, the Dr. Emmett Brown guy, who's fat, decides to steal the horse. Because of course. With the help of the old blind woman. In fact, he at one point suggests that he could help her. Probably get laid. To make her less grumpy. The horse is stolen, and then a chase ensues with Tuck, TJ, the circus, the boy, the paleontologist, and everybody else. All of them fight, but eventually they discover the miniature horse because, of course, all of them venture into a cavern that grows into a giant cavern, which then becomes a valley, which I'm going to assume they're going off of the whole Hollow Earth theory, because this is exactly what this is. We don't like Adam Wingard. Suddenly, the boy is picked up by a pteranodon with bat wings. Batodon. Sounds cooler than the actual dinosaur. Batadon then suddenly gets drunk and falls and tries to choke out the boy, eventually dying. And then we're introduced to our man, the myth, the legend, Allie. The Saurus. The Tyrannosaurus Rex. But Allosaurus at the same time. You know, he's a species fluid. He can kind of decide whatever he wants. He fights a Triceratops Styracosaurus and attacks our people over the course of the next 20 minutes in long drawn-out scenes with various bits of comedy, only for the cowboys to run out and then the dinosaur to get stuck because he's too fat because he's been eating too much. Eventually, he gets knocked out cold by rocks and transferred into Gwangi the Great. But as Gwangi the Great is on his way to a new show, the old woman is found, and she likes to say things that are mysterious and boding, only for her to make it happen. So she's kind of a liar. It's good she gets trampled on later on. Spoiler alert! Eventually, Gwangi the Great is unveiled after a elephant continues to sing its banter. As Gwangi's revealed, the tiny person from the beginning of the movie who stole the horse and then helped the old blind woman is killed. And then Gwangi breaks out without the need of what he did anyway, so it was kind of pointless. He kind of died in vain. Gwangi then kills the elephant and attacks Mexico. He did not eat any burritos, enchiladas, or tacos. But clearly something happened. He probably ate some beans because he had some fiery gas that helped blow up and create a raging fire in a cathedral. It's also important to note he was called El Diablo, so it's probably the fact he was the devil. He was the devil in disguise.
The devil in disguise.
So when you see Gwangi, make sure you recount what Elvis said and say, "You the devil in disguise. Oh yes you are. I thought I was in heaven, but I was sure surprised. Heaven help me, I didn't see the devil in your eye. Gwangi, you're an angel." Gwangi dies in a fiery inferno. And then we get the closing credits. You the Gwangi in disguise.
That might be
yes,
your best,
you are.
That might be your best one yet.
I thought I was in the valley, but I was sure surprised. Heaven help me, I didn't see the Gwangi in your eye.
We've got a lot of music references going on this episode.
It's a
Well,
musically inclined movie.
You know what? It might work. It just might work. Singing cowboys and dinosaurs. It could work.
I'd see singing, dancing cowboys with dinosaurs.
I would too.
You know, maybe I should write Devil in Disguise, but it's Gwangi, a parody. Kind of like
there you go. Weird
the
Al.
Kaiju Conversation rap, you know?
Oh yeah, there you go. There you go. We'll play it next year. You can start doing parody rap songs for all the movies.
It's not a rap song, it's a love ballad.
Oh, that's true. Parody
I can
songs.
do a parody love ballad.
Parody love
And then
ballad.
we'll release it all as an LP, you know?
An LP. Oh yeah. The Elijah Thomas, what do we call it?
Saurus Ears.
Saurus
The parodies of Kaiju Conversation and Co.
There you go. There you go. Alrighty, well, let's start getting into this. It's going to be hard to top that synopsis. I'm just saying. So, was not expecting to see this logo when we started. I'm too used to the modern WB logo.
Yeah, it was kind of wild. It's superimposed in front of a day for night sequence, which
Yeah.
there is a lot of day for night stuff in this movie, and I guess that's something that's very like modern in the context of this movie, because the late 60s and 70s, we did see a lot of day for night stuff. That was a common occurrence, especially in special effects films where they were struggling to, have the budget to shoot in proper lighting and whatnot.
Yeah, supposedly, and I've yet to confirm this, but supposedly the first time that the modern Warner Brothers logo appeared was in the movie Gremlins.
Really?
Yeah. May have to confirm that though. But I think I saw something. I think I was watching a special feature on Gremlins and they said, "Oh yeah, this is the first time that the WB logo appeared." I don't know. I may have to double check that because I swear it appeared before then.
Now, I do want to say, even though I just complained about the shots, the on-location stuff, which, I mean, this film was entirely shot on location as far as I'm concerned. It's beautiful. I love all of the setting of this film.
I love that it's all real. Every time I watch an older movie like this, and I think to myself, they're not green screen in this. That's real. Right. Like you see these bizarre, later on, we see these bizarre rock formations, and I'm like, man, those are actually real. You can't fake this. No way.
Absolutely.
You can't fake stuff like this.
And on top of all that, specifically in this opening, there's this mini waterfall into this tiny puddle, I guess, of water. And we have this character kind of, stumbling all through it because he's all bloody and whatnot. But the fact that that is a real waterfall, that was something that they just found as they were walking around scouting, and it works. It was a great place to shoot this, and they did, and it turned out to be, I think, really cool. All this stuff is really cool in the context of the locations. Like you said, the rock formations, all of it's just beautiful.
And our story actually starts off kind of intriguing at first. I will say, for the first minute or two, you if you didn't know what you were getting into, you'd probably just think this is a Western, just any old Western. But then we got a guy carrying a bag, and the bag's making a lot of weird noise.
Now, I will say, in this opening, it kind of is weird because after this, I really feel like this opening is just kind of dropped. All these people are kind of irrelevant. I mean, they come back once, and then a couple of the characters.
The crazy old lady with the eye patch gets a couple of scenes after this.
Right. But that's really it.
Yeah.
And I, honestly, these people are obviously the Skull Island native people, stand-ins.
Yeah, basically.
Their role, but it's something that I noticed in Mighty Joe Young, and I like this, but also it's just the fact that it's still obvious they're pulling from that King Kong script. Is that King Kong script is so good, and then as time goes on with Mighty Joe and then Gwangi, they're very clearly trying to remove the King Kongisms, but instead of just creating a whole new story and outline, they're pulling everything out of what made King Kong so good, and they're just briefly addressing it. And that would work if they brought in new stuff, but because they're not bringing in a ton of new stuff, they're only changing the locations and the time periods and whatnot and the characters. It just feels undercooked, or there's threads of this that are left just kind of underdeveloped. And
which becomes an issue as the movie goes on, because one of the things that surprises me is that it feels like two different movies, because we don't even get foreshadowing other than Tia Zarina is her name, the old woman, saying that Gwangi and the Valley, Tia Zarina, it's a place of evil and you must not anger them or whatever. Other than that is the closest we get to foreshadowing that dinosaurs are in this thing.
Right. And
because the first 30 minutes ends up being about the horse. They go to the valley, the horse disappears and not even brought up again.
Right. I just realized, yeah, you are right. The horse, like, once the horse goes into the cave, it's completely irrelevant.
Yeah. It was just an excuse to get them to the valley, which you can make that argument for King Kong, but King Kong was still foreshadowed before we got there. We knew on the boat, because Denham says, have you ever heard of Kong? So we at least know that there's some large creature there. We don't know it's a gorilla, but we know there's a large creature there. That is set up. But here we get nothing. It's just they go to the valley. Oh, crap, there are dinosaurs. Hey, remember that tiny horse? No? Okay.
Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, I do want to say that I love the opening credits here. It's all very colorful, and it kind of reminds me of a 60s TV show, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. Like Lost in Space or something.
Mm-hmm. It's a little fancier than I think a Western television show would be at this point. But it also, thanks to the old lady talking about the curse, much like with Kong, we get the establishment of legendary or supernatural elements. Now, the problem is that in Kong, they at least played around with that a little bit. Here, they do and they don't. They're very quick to explain it all away.
Right, and I think that's where, like, for Kong, which, by the way, I'm just going to establish this now for anybody listening, the comparisons to Kong are 110% not going away. That's going to be something that we're going to talk about, I think, for the entirety of this film. So, what's so amazing about the supernatural elements of King Kong is only what the marketing is. They market Kong as King Kong. The islanders view him as a king or a god, and the islanders in their primitive, like, understanding of the modern world at the time, they view Kong as the supernatural character, the supernatural being that needs sacrifices. Whereas when you get the white man, the modern day white man from America going to Skull Island, they immediately remove all of that supernatural element. And that creates an interesting dynamic because you have the culture against the science. And it ends up being something I think really memorable. And I think every iteration of King Kong, when they cover the natives and the modern white man, I think the dynamic there is very well done. Whereas here, they specifically call our villain a gypsy.
Yeah, which is a little awkward for some people. And I did look that up. I was like, really? How does that work? There's no way. But then I looked up, nope. Actually, around this time, there were gypsy immigrants who went to Mexico.
So she says the name of Gwangi specifically El Diablo is the horse.
Yeah, El Diablo is the horse.
So it's not even the horse is from the valley and they call it El Diablo, which is the devil, but that doesn't really work out in its favor. But everything she says about Gwangi and the valley ends up either just happening by coincidence or she makes it happen, such as when Gwangi breaks out. I understand why it's included, but doing stuff like that completely removes the idea of Gwangi being anything more than an animal, which would work if Gwangi had more of a Mighty Joe approach and they really either anthropomorphized or just created Gwangi as this tragic being of, this creature didn't want to be in the new world, but mankind brought it to the new world and it has to suffer. They entirely put Gwangi as this villainous monster. And it's more akin to what I think is the modern day Jurassic World movies, where it's these aren't real animals that we need to feel for. This is a monster that dies, and we celebrate that. And that's something, again, like the original King Kong has a great, like, tragic backstory for King Kong. That's stripped away here. It was still somewhat present in Mighty Joe, but here in Gwangi, that's completely gone. And I think that loses a little bit of that depth that Gwangi should have if we're following the King Kong story approach that this film is.
Yeah. Now, I did find an article where the writer, his name was Stark Holborn, did argue that Gwangi still embodied something like that. His argument went like this, quote, "It doesn't take a leap of imagination to see Gwangi's fate as synonymous with the fate of many Native Americans, as captive curiosities in the early days of westward expansion and later playing burlesque versions of themselves in Wild West shows, just like TJ's," end quotes. He also extended something kind of like that to the love story, which we'll unpack a little bit more when we get there, between TJ and Tuck, because it plays at the traditional theme of the Western, which is the domination of the wild by the civilized for monetary gain, domestic security, and ultimately for procreation to consolidate that security. Make of that what you will.
I see where he's coming from, but I feel like the whole Gwangi stands for what occurred to Native Americans only goes so far when you realize that the show that is showcasing Gwangi has Native Americans employed. Granted, it's for a racist stereotype, essentially, with the Cowboys versus Indians setup that they do for their show. Those same
I'm not
people,
even sure all of those were actually Native Americans either.
I doubt it. But the fact that, like, that's something, and then that same show is what showcases Gwangi, and there's no background, or there's no, like, internal conversation on Gwangi being there or not being there. The only thing that's argued is, do we have this show go on? Actually, it's not even do we have the show go on. It's TJ's, do I go with the love of my life or do I stay and make money?
Yeah.
Like, that's all. Gwangi is 110% objectified through the entirety of this film. And besides our gypsy, that gives it that supernatural element, but then we see behind the curtain the entire time that she's just kind of pulling the strings. Nothing, there is no dialogue for Gwangi. And I do believe that comes down to the fact that this was supposed to be a monster on the loose rampage movie. I think that's just kind of par for the course. Similar to that of Beast. Beast from the 20,000 Fathoms, you know?
Yeah. Well, and then after we get those pencil drawings and the credits, Ray's also credited as an associate producer, I wrote in my notes.
Yeah.
And then we get our establishing text, I guess you say, our establishing title card. It says somewhere south of the Rio Grande at the turn of the century. And then I wish I had brought this up earlier when we were talking about this. I wrote that this is fairly late for a Western. And I wondered if maybe this was probably accidentally meta. So we're setting this movie, a Western movie, just after the cowboy era historically. And we already talked about how this was slightly late to catch the popularity of both Westerns and monster movies. Interesting little parallel. Yeah, interesting little parallel there. And then we're introduced to, I wrote him down as a Kenny in this, but there's a kid who kind of like this in 20 Million Miles to Earth as well.
Yeah. And I almost feel like that's more of a Harryhausen thing than anything. I feel like that's just kind of, what kind of sucks is, unlike 20 Million Miles to Earth, I feel like this kid's not given nearly as much material to work with. Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense. Yeah, I'm trying to remember, what's the kid's name again? Rowdy? No, that's one of the other guys.
Rudy?
No, I think it's is it Rowdy? Let me double check.
I think it is Rowdy. I'm pretty sure.
Lope. Rowdy is one of the cowboys. He's a little urchin, little bit of a con artist, I think.
Yeah.
You know, playing the orphan card pretty hard.
Yeah, he convinces our main character, Tuck, to give him money so he will get him a horse and show him, basically just kind of be his guide. And from there, he just kind of says, okay. And they end up going to the circus. Is it a circus, technically?
It's considered a circus in most of the things that I look at. Yeah.
So,
Oh wait, no. Tuck used to work for Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, which was a real thing. But let's see. No, it's a rodeo.
No.
Excuse me, not a circus.
Rodeo.
It's a rodeo.
Yeah. So he worked for this rodeo, and now he works with Buffalo Bill, if I remember right.
Yes.
And he's out trying to get new acts for Buffalo Bill.
So you could, I don't know. See, this is where the parallels to Kong start to break down a little bit, because they kind of split Carl Denham between Tuck and TJ.
Right.
I think Tuck has a little bit more Denham in him, but as the movie goes on, particularly when we get to the end, a lot of it starts shifting to TJ.
Right. And that's the weird,
and we don't have a
change.
Yeah, and we don't have a true Andero in this. You could argue it's TJ, but it's not really.
And honestly, I attribute most of that to what I believe is one of the biggest problems in the film, and that's the characters.
Yeah.
I don't think there's really a through line to TJ going from I'm here for these people to I'm here for the money. Because she's offered money here at the beginning, and she declines it to be with the people. They need her, right? That's her argument. And then by the end of the film, she's like, no, I'm going to be a part of this because of the money. It's like, okay, well, there was no, there is, and even, they do write this in the film because it's such a jarring change. Our main character, Tuck's what happened to literally everything we talked about. I think that's kind of interesting that they do, highlight that her sudden changes out of the blue, because it is a complete 180. These two characters 180 each other in the last act of the film, which is realistically the last 15 minutes.
Yeah And it doesn't help that Mr. Franciscus, one of the articles that I read on this movie, James Franciscus, he described this guy as a quote unquote poor man's Charlton Heston.
I could see that. I could see it.
Yeah. I don't. Well, I mean, you'll do the actor breakdown later, but I will admit I don't know these actors very well. These are certainly, at least to me, not the most famous actors in a Harryhausen movie. But
yeah, I definitely have a rundown of a bulk of the cast.
Yeah, we'll get to that. So we're introduced to the rodeo and to TJ, and this is when we find out that these are former lovers and all that. And we also get our first effect shot, and it's TJ on her horse, and it's a little weird. It's a little weird because it starts off live action, and I will admit the set for this is impressive because the gimmick here, and I want to know, I can't imagine this was actually done in real life, because this seems like a remarkably dangerous stunt on several levels. But it's this whole high diving into a pool of water thing, which is kind of a classic rodeo or circus stunt. But what they do here is TJ, in her skimpy little outfit, rides her horse up this ramp to the top of this platform, and all that's live action. And then at the top, she gets the horse to jump off, and they magically land in the pool, and nobody drowns, including the horse. And that was a special effect.
And it's, I think, kind of dubious at best for this one.
Yeah.
Like, this is probably the worst effect in the film.
Yeah, it's not a great start. If you see this and you think, well, is this how all the effects are going to be? No. You shut off the movie, I'm sorry, but no.
Now, she does, like, stall out
Mm-hmm.
whenever she sees him, which, fair enough, whatever. But after the fact, we get their first actual interaction when she gets off the horse and she's, trying to get to essentially her dressing room. And this is where we find out that the actress is not saying her lines. And that's because
Lord.
the actress here, she had a very thick accent.
She was Israeli.
So they hired a voice actor who is uncredited. We don't know who it was.
Yeah. The onset actress is Gila Golan. I hope I said that correctly.
And
she's a Polish-born Israeli.
And so because of her thick accent, they put in a voice actor to do the ADR work on it. And her voice is so crisp and clear in contrast to everybody else. The sound mixing for her specifically is not the greatest. And it's throughout the entirety of it.
Yeah, it doesn't sound great because it sounds too good. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds very artificial compared to everybody else. And it really sticks out.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that was probably the only ADR work that they did.
Yeah, I would assume so. Now, something I do think is interesting is she's introduced in this very skimpy outfit for this stunt. And after this, she changes. And from here on, she doesn't bear any of the skimpy outfits. But we also get some clear sexism in their interaction in her dressing room.
The fact that he's even walking into her dressing room. I mean, this is 1969. That's kind of on the cusp of how scandalous this is going to be in a movie. Right. It's only been a few years since the Hays Code had been relaxed and things like that. But he says things to her like he threatens to, quote unquote, put you over my knee.
Yeah.
Wow. And then the funny, that was a different time. But then the funny thing is, he tells her to go change, to change while he's around as well. Which it's like this is 1969. It's like kind of ahead of its time, but not really. But she does basically tell him off too. So it's like this weird clash of sensibilities where you have TJ trying to act like a quote unquote modern woman, but he's still trying to act like an old fashioned guy.
Right. And then later on, they kind of give her the more traditionalists with what Tuck kind of pitches to her, like kids and a ranch and land and all that. And so she reverts to the traditional woman, and then she converts out of that. So she's not a traditional woman, then she is, then she's not.
Yeah.
And then she is. Which is, again, it goes back to the whole back and forth of the characterization of all of our people we're following. It's very back and forth.
Yeah, even Tuck is like that too, although Tuck is still a little bit more consistent.
Right.
Because once he decides, you know what? I think I like... Because he comes across as almost like a Han Solo, I'm the lovable scoundrel. I'm going to go do my own thing. I don't need to settle down. I'm a wild man, that sort of a thing. And then as time goes on in this little adventure, he's like, you know what? I really do want that house and that simple life and kids and all that. And then by the end of the movie, he's like, let's go do that. And then that's when she has her last little turn. And she's like, no, I've got a dinosaur. I'm going to make money. It'll be great. Even though that's how he starts too. He's there initially to make money off the horse. And then when he finds out about the dinosaurs, it's like, let's make money off the dinosaurs. And then he has second thoughts.
And it would make more sense if there was some development of these characters, right? Like if the relationship between Tuck and TJ wasn't just they're sexually frustrated with each other and then sexually into each other. Like that's how it goes. They're frustrated with each other, and then the next time they see each other, they end up kissing and making out, and he's shirtless in her dress.
Now, I will admit, I give these two credit. They play that well. The problem is that it gets very inconsistent after this.
Right. Because then after that, they're back to being at each other's throats, and then they're not, and then they are, and then they're not.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. It's such a yo-yo thing, and they do try throughout the movie to give them some moments for character development. It just feels a little undercooked.
A little,
yeah. I know, humorous understatement, but yeah, it needed more time.
So back into the film, Tuck and Lope go off on a journey, and they're interrupted with our main supporting character,
the paleontologist,
Professor Bromley.
Professor Bromley, who was not in the original script. He was added in the second draft.
And it definitely feels like he is.
Yeah, he was added to make the characters more grounded and believable, interestingly, and to add a little bit of humor. I would also argue that he's the counterpoint to Tia, the crazy old lady with the eye patch, because he's Mr. Science Man. But
right.
You could argue he was inspired by Professor Challenger from The Lost World, although Professor Challenger is more of a heroic scientist. Compared to
hardy.
Professor Bromley, where Professor Bromley is more like your quirky old grandma. He might arguably be closer to a Hammond from the movie version of Jurassic Park.
I would say he's more like a mad scientist from like a 50s B movie.
Yeah.
Because he ends up being a villain character, which is weird. Maybe not villain, but like anti-hero. Like he's the whole reason things kind of go wrong initially.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he definitely feels like a modern 50s science fiction movie kind of a character.
Right. And
so he feels almost he's not an anachronism, but he almost feels like an anachronism because we're not used to seeing this kind of a character in this setting.
Right. And one thing I did think is really weird is he is like our comic relief for a bulk of the movie. Which is weird because in Mighty Joe Young, if I remember correctly, Ray Harryhausen was not thrilled that they were making it more lighthearted and more of a comedy. Whereas here, there is comedy throughout the film. It made me think about the whole argument of like, oh, modern blockbusters have too much comedy in them. And then you see a film like this, and it's like, okay, no, so Valley of Gwangi also has quite a few quips and moments throughout the film that are comedic, especially with our paleontologist here. I mean, his whole introduction is he has lost his horse, and whenever he's asked to get on a horse, he ends up getting on the mule. Like he doesn't want to like be a cowboy. He's very much a man of science, and we see that throughout the film.
Yeah. Now, I will admit, historically speaking, this is interesting because he's name-dropping people like Darwin and such. And Darwin and the theory of evolution would have been relatively new at this point historically. Origin of the Species had just been published in the 1880s. So these are all still relatively new ideas that he's talking about here, which I guess might have been the intention with the script, because you have the kind of basically the new science clashing with the old ways even though that doesn't get brought up as much as you would think.
Right. And that's something in of itself I really wish was, because this film has so much potential for the whole modern versus tradition
Right.
idea. And it sucks that it's completely undermined. I mean, here, once we get back to the professor's, I guess, where he's living at,
Mm-hmm.
he gives us a whole exposition dump of paleontology and like what his mission in life is, and
Which is very much in keeping with a 50s
yes.
monster movie. That is a weird trope with particularly in the 50s, where they just feel the need to stop for several minutes and give you a science lesson.
Right. And bear in mind, by the time that this scene is done, we are at about 20 minutes of this film. So we have had 20 minutes of character introduction, exposition, and character explanation.
And one special effects shot.
That is dubious at best. And I wouldn't be...
Because it was very obviously a doll.
Right. And the problem here, and normally I don't complain about setup. I love setup. But the problem here is in 20 minutes... They introduce all these characters. They introduce Lope, Tuck, the paleontologist TJ, the guy who runs the rodeo, Carlos, and the woman. And we don't get to spend much time with them. And it seems like Tuck is going to be our main character. But in all of this, it just kind of seems like he's along for the ride. He's not really doing much to engage or do anything. He's just there to help us get from point A to point B to point C, and then back to point A. And this was the beginning of me being like, man, this movie's really drawn out. This is kind of boring. I feel like you could cut half of everything that's been put into this first 20 minutes, and it be pretty much exactly where it's at.
Possibly. And then
I was just going to say, if I like restructured things, I would have Lope and Tuck on their way to go to the rodeo and meet the professor, and then they go to the rodeo.
That would make sense, actually. Yeah, get as many of the character introductions in those first few minutes as possible.
Right.
Yeah, I could see that. But speaking of the rodeo, that's where we go. We go back to the rodeo and we see a bullfight.
Right, and then we're introduced to a subplot that goes nowhere, pretty much.
Yeah, because is this when we're introduced to the other cowboy characters? I forget.
Yeah, this is where Carlos, which we get the exposition of Carlos is owed money by TJ, but there's more. And then Carlos wants a relationship with her. And that creates something that ends up going nowhere. There is no tension there. And what really ruins it is at the very end of this whole scene, this is where we get the first kiss between Tuck and TJ.
Yeah,
and
after, because he tries to intervene on the bullfight. We do get an interesting little POV shot from the bullhorns, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And it also disproves the whole seeing red myth. Because they used to say, because matador capes are red, they used to say that the bulls hate seeing things that are red. That's why they charge at. No, it's not that, because this guy's cape looks like a lavender, maybe even a pink. It's the fact that it's flapping. That's what they don't like.
Right.
And so he gets hurt, and then he wakes up, and it's made to look like it's sexy time, but it's actually a medical examination. But it looks like Tuck wants it to be sexy time.
Right. And I remember thinking, like, because Carlos intervenes, I interpreted that as like he's trying to show off to TJ. But then TJ and Tuck just start kissing.
Yeah.
right after the bull's gone. And then, like you said, we cut to this whole medical exam. And it's like, okay, so the love story's here now. Again, like, we're like 23 minutes in, and now we have the love story. and there's no setup for it. There's no payoff. There was no payoff to the kiss. It was so abrupt that like all of that weight suddenly was gone.
Yeah, and by the
then
way, they were saving Lope.
Yeah.
bull.
They were
So the
'cause
Kenny's
Lope-
causing trouble.
right. Lope went out, which I get it, but also like why Lope would know better. Like I would imagine, considering Lope's living situation.
Yeah.
I don't get it. I thought it was kind of a weird choice to give Lope that
Yeah.
moment of problem, like a problem situation.
Yeah. But this is to show that, oh, yeah, so these two are still attracted to each other, but TJ still wants to help the rodeo and make money off of the rodeo. And she says, well, I had got something that nobody's ever seen that's going to get a bunch of butts and seats for this rodeo. And this is when we go to see El Diablo.
Right. And then
The
Tuck-
Eopagus?
yes.
The
And
horse.
Tuck like freaks out over it. Like he goes on and on about like all the money this could rack in. And they explain like the basically the idea is it's a horse riding a horse. That's the whole skit, and it'll make a ton of money. Which
Eohippus. Eohippus.
Yeah. Which I am okay with this, but like you said, now like thinking about it, the fact that this whole like we're introduced to this subplot and then this becomes basically the next like 20 minutes only for it to be dropped. And bear in mind, if it is over the next 20 minutes, which I might be over exaggerating a little bit, but that's over half the movie. Half the movie's been spent on a subplot that gets dropped in exposition.
Yeah, this is a 96-minute movie.
So focusing on stuff like this and making this like a major plot element just doesn't work for me.
Yeah. Now, let's pause here and talk a bit about El Diablo, the Eohippus here. The model that we're seeing on screen was 8 to 9 inches long and about 7 inches tall. And Ray considers this some of the smoothest and most natural animation he's ever done. Even though it was animated with great haste. And what we're seeing here, I will admit, it's a superimposition. These were two different plates that were filmed. And I give them credit. It does actually look pretty good. It is obvious that these are two separate plates, but considering that our actors are standing behind it, not trying to walk around it or necessarily touch or interact with El Diablo, I do think that helps it quite a bit. So even though it is obvious that it's two separate plates, it still looks pretty good. And yeah, I do think the animation on it is impressive. And considering that, yes, even though this is a very tiny horse, obviously a horse is a creature that people see quite often in real life. So we know what a horse looks like and how it moves. So there's a little bit more of an expectation that this has to look good. And for sure, Ray made it work.
Now, I failed to bring up, but when we were introduced to our paleontologist, he did specifically talk about this miniature horse.
Yes.
And that's how Tuck knows about it and is baffled when he sees it.
Mm-hmm.
So after he's introduced to the miniature horse, what does Tuck do? He goes and gets the paleontologist and introduces him to a living miniature horse.
Mm-hmm.
He like freaks out over it. And this is the beginning of the character change for our paleontologist.
Mm-hmm.
Him and Tuck go to Carlos to try and get him to agree to take them where they found the miniature horse to maybe find more, and he declines it. But he is given, if I remember right, he's given the name of our gypsy, and then the three, including Lupe, go and visit her and inquire about it.
Yeah.
Which, this is where we really get the paleontologist's villainous side. Maybe he even, like, offers himself up. I don't remember the exact dialogue, but I know he's like, I can help you out.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, good to know. And
Yeah.
this is the only other scene we get with all of these people that are associated with our older woman character.
Mhm.
Like, after this, they're not really relevant. And
No.
they are supposed to be the ones that kind of view Gwangi as the supernatural being. And it's really felt that there's no weight to Gwangi as a creature whatsoever.
Yeah, Gwangi keeps getting mentioned, but I don't know, it's just not carrying the weight that hearing Denham talk about Kong did before we get to Skull Island in the original in the Kong 33 movie.
Maybe it's just the fact that Robert Armstrong's a really good actor and these people are not.
I suppose, that could be part of it. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but we're moving right along here. So where do we want to go to next with this?
Well, after this, the miniature horse gets stolen.
Yeah, the miniature horse gets stolen, and then that causes a whole hullabaloo. Well, and the miniature horse, El Diablo, is from the Forbidden Valley. That's as much explanation we get for this thing.
Right.
And the bizarre thing about that is we see no other wildlife in the Forbidden Valley that even remotely resembles El Diablo.
Right.
When we get to the valley, it's all dinosaurs. So it almost feels, like I said before, it almost feels like two movies merged together. I don't want to say that El Diablo is an afterthought, but like I said, once you get to the valley, it's a hard shift into dinosaur movie land.
Right, because El Diablo basically becomes the central focal point of this movie for quite a while. Because after this, it gets stolen, and then TJ and the rodeo goes looking.
It's stolen by the midget too, and I did write in my notes: a tiny man goes after a tiny horse. So many jokes.
So
yeah,
the professor is out looking. We have the rodeo people out looking. Lupe and Tucker out looking, and they all, in cliche fashion, eventually meet up with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So the search, and which, by the way, I will say, during all of the searching, there is some very nice.
The scenery is great.
Yeah, and some pretty good matte paintings.
Yeah. So we get a posse together to go find the horse that's been stolen. And
this posse ends up, the idea of the miniature horse kind of shows up around the 25-minute mark.
Mm-hmm.
And then the posse eventually finds the horse at the
because their goal is to release the horse back in the valley so they can avert the curse. Right.
And the rodeo wants to keep the horse, and Tuck wants to help find the horse.
Mm-hmm.
He actually goes to help find it for TJ, but then they all blame him for the horse getting stolen.
Mm-hmm.
So what really sucks is we spend about 20 minutes. It is about 20 minutes looking and focusing on this horse until they find the entryway to the valley.
Mm-hmm.
And the valley, the whole entryway is very similar to that of King Kong, with the gate. And
yeah, except it's a narrow passage between presumably some mountains. I'm trying to understand the geography of this thing.
I couldn't get it.
Yeah, because if this idea is that the valley is surrounded by just this circle of mountains, I think that's the idea. And then there's just these cracks in it that you can pass through, but it still begs questions like, how did none of the other wildlife ever find one of these passages and get out?
Right.
And I don't know. I said way back when I did Kong 33, it was my first ever film discussion episode, that trying to make sense of the ecology of Skull Island is not the point, because the King Kong movie is supposed to be mythic and not realistic.
Okay, but King Kong makes more sense. There's a giant wall that has a bulk of the island, or a small part of the island, like protected by the creatures and everything.
And the fact that it is an island, which means unless you have wildlife that can fly or swim, they're all stuck there anyway.
Right.
So it's easier to isolate. Now, it's the Lost World, where it was a valley up in the mountains that was cut off from everything. But this isn't up in the mountains. This is apparently cut off by a mountain range. I don't know. It's just weird that they went this route with it. I mean, we'll talk about this when we get to a scene later where they utilize this passageway again, which Ray said he wasn't entirely happy with. But still, it is a strange...
Yeah, they definitely utilized it in the same fashion that they did for King Kong 33.
Yeah.
Our cowboys eventually open up the passageway so it's a little bit bigger so they can fit the horses in. Mm-hmm. And then we see them journey into the Forbidden Valley, which there's some really good matte paintings in all of this as well. Yeah.
This is when we get to one of the core aspects of a Kong story, which is our journey into a heart of darkness. Yeah, into the unknown.
And I would go as far as to say this is really when the film takes a turn and becomes a King Kong knockoff.
Oh yeah, for sure. This is the moment where the Kong tropes really start to show up.
Right. So we kind of have a Kong trope at the beginning, and then here about halfway through. So I will say, like, a portion of this, like maybe a fourth of the movie has been like created for Gwangi itself, but it's sandwiched in between two Kongisms.
Yeah.
And the Kongisms don't go away.
No, they don't. There's arguably visual callbacks to Kong. There's some story beats that are a bit similar, because it's the same sort of idea. This is the moment in Kong 33 where Denham and Anne and Jack and a bunch of crew members go on to Skull Island. We don't have the part where Anne gets kidnapped in this, but we have these cowboys instead of sailors dealing with dinosaur attacks. And I write in my notes that at about the 47-minute mark, that's when we finally get a dinosaur, and that's the Pteranodon. Although I also wrote before this that we get to see some spectacular rock formations as they just explore the valley, which I really appreciated.
I do too, yeah.
Because these rock formations are uncanny, but these are naturally occurring rock formations. I watched the special features and read in the books, like, yeah, these were real rock formations that they found. And they're like, make sure we get this on film, because we can use this. But anyway, 47 minutes in, we get a Pteranodon.
And I haven't seen 1 Million Years BC in a long time, but I do know there's a scene similar where a Pteranodon attacks.
Some of the models were recycled from that movie.
And so Lupe gets taken away, very much like Raquel Welch.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like I said in my plot synopsis, randomly the Pteranodon just kind of falls to the ground and is like trying to kill Lupe still?
Eat him?
It's weird. It just kind of happens.
Yeah, because they needed something perilous to happen.
Right.
And they needed a dinosaur attack. That's because the dinosaurs were in the trailer. We got to get the dinosaurs in there.
Right. So Carlos ends up like snapping this Pteranodon's neck.
Okay. You got to admit, that's probably one of the most badass moments in this movie.
Yeah.
Like,
he
just goes up, and they're switching between Ray's puppet and an on-set prop.
Which looks good. I think
it actually looks pretty good. And you have Carlos coming up behind this thing and snapping its neck like he's in special forces.
Yeah.
It's crazy. I'm just like, this guy's got bragging rights for life. All 2 days of it. Carlos was strutting around after. I was like, yeah, I snapped a Pteranodon's neck. What'd you do today? I remember the first time I saw this, I'm like, Did not expect to see a dinosaur's neck get snapped today. Was not on my bingo card.
Yeah, it's definitely a really fun moment. And honestly, I'd say this might be my favorite actual interaction between a human and the dinosaurs in this movie.
Yeah.
Because after this, it's kind of like they're just kind of running and they occasionally interact, and that's about it. Which is good, but also bad at the same time, right? Because it's like, okay, so the greatest interaction between the humans and the dinosaurs is the first fight.
Mm-hmm.
And after this, that first fight's the highlight, like in terms of the human on dinosaur action. I know a lot of people like the roping up sequence, but part of me also just kind of felt underwhelmed because it is taken straight from Mighty Joe Young. So if you've seen Mighty Joe Young, you've seen this before.
For sure. This is also, at this point in my notes, I wrote, and I forgot about this little comparison I drew, to another scientist in a Harryhausen movie. And that was I said Bromley reminds me of Professor Elson because he's advocating for keeping the dinosaur alive.
Right. Yeah, and that's another trope of monster movies from the 50s where the scientist wants to keep the monster alive.
Yep. We even see it in the original Godzilla with Dr. Yamane.
Mm-hmm.
So
we are introduced after this to another dinosaur on the topic of dinosaurs.
Yes, the ornithomimus. All the dinosaur nerds are yelling at me right now.
Which this scene specifically influenced the introduction of the Tyrannosaurus Rex in Jurassic Park. Because as this little dinosaur is running away from our cowboys, it is eaten by Gwangi himself.
Mm-hmm. And there is a scene in the original Jurassic Park that is almost shot for shot this. Yeah. The difference being it was a herd that gets ambushed by a T-Rex.
Now, we do get somewhere in all of this, Dr. Bromley says, "Great Scott."
Yeah. Great Scott.
Which I thought was really funny just because of the whole Dr. Emmett Brown thing.
Yeah.
And they do look very similar.
They do. I guess that means at some point they could have remade Valley of Gwangi and had Christopher Lloyd be Professor Bromley. Can't really do it now because, well, I don't know. I mean, he's old. Very.
It's okay. He's looked old his whole life.
Yeah, that is true. He has looked old his entire life. But yes, this is our introduction to Gwangi here. And it's like, oh, geez, how long into the movie is it at this point?
We're about 52 minutes.
I was going to say, it's not quite an hour, but it's still relatively late in the movie to get our title character finally.
Yeah, there's about 45.
Yeah.
It's about halfway. It's a little over halfway through the film.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of our favorite Godzilla movies, just saying.
Yeah, but you and I have both explained how well the Godzilla's presence is still.
Yeah, now, I will say this. This introduction was Ray's doing. The original script was much more basic, he said. It's just that Gwangi just showed up and saw them. It was his idea to do the thing where he catches the ornithomimus in his mouth. So.
I feel like it's an ornithymus, but I could be wrong.
It says ornithomimus here.
Okay.
Yeah. Or ornithymus might be the easier way to say it. But anyway, it was his idea to do that. So then he starts going after Bromley specifically, and then the Styracosaurus shows up.
Yeah, and then, I mean, after this, if I remember right, the cowboys discover the cave that they hide out in for 10 minutes.
Yep.
Of this film, which we also learned that the rifles they brought, the reason is like, this is funny.
It's funny, but it's also stupid. Come on. It's almost like it almost reeks of the screenwriter wrote himself into a corner and had to come up with a way to get out of it. because he realized, like, wait, I wrote that they were shooting at the dinosaurs and they did nothing. Well, I can't just say the dinosaurs are bulletproof. So I'm going to say, oh, they forgot to pack real bullets. They've been using blanks the entire time because they took them from the show. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that, it was set up. So that's not the issue. The issue is, really? No one thought to make sure that they got the right guns and had real bullets?
Or even brought bullets? Like, I really struggle. I struggle with that.
Yeah, I kind of joked in my notes that it's the opposite of The Crow. It's the opposite problem of The Crow, where they accidentally put real bullets in when it was supposed to be blanks, which is how Brandon Lee famously died on set. But it's a way to account for the fact that they were shooting at dinosaurs and nothing happened, and also to put our characters at a disadvantage.
Right. Which, by the way, during all of this, we eventually get the whole horse thief thing again. So we're now 50, almost an hour into this movie, and we're still on the horse. And then the last 35 minutes completely drops the horse.
Yeah, because being a horse thief is like the worst thing ever around here. Forget about being, were you an outlaw and you robbed trains and shot the sheriff and but not the deputy and all these other people. Oh, that's bad. But wait, you stole a horse? Ooh, we're gonna have to take you out to go see the firing squad right now.
But it is clarified it was the paleontologist. So
it was the
like that's all clear.
Yeah.
But if you want to talk about worse than stealing a miniature horse, we get more day for night shots. And
is this the scene where Tuck and TJ are talking?
Yes.
And it's supposed to pass as character development?
Yeah. And then it's interrupted with our paleontologist falling into the trap.
Yeah, because they were setting a trap to catch Gwangi, and instead they catch a paleontologist. Well,
now I will say they do somewhere in this time, it could be a little bit later, but they do also utilize like roars to like build some tension, which is a good idea. They only do it once, so it doesn't really help. But like, that's a good idea.
Yeah,
like,
I swore. I actually, speaking of which, I actually wrote in my notes that I swore the Pteranodon was voiced by a person. I mean, it's not unreasonable. Frank Welker, besides playing Megatron among other characters, also made a huge chunk of his career doing animal noises, including a certain lizard who thinks he's a Japanese dinosaur. Funny how that works. Anyway.
Shaggyzilla?
Shagzilla? Oh my.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Gwangi's back in the movie, by the way.
Yeah, Gwangi's back in the movie. And this is where we get the iconic roping scene.
Right. Which I will say, like, the composites with Gwangi and the ropes and the horses and the people and the foregrounds and the backgrounds. Like, this is a really elaborate scene, and it looks really good.
Yeah, and the way they did it was they actually had a guy driving a Jeep with a pole, and the actors on set would rope the pole, and the guy would drive the Jeep around to create the resistance. So the actors are actually pulling on something on set, and then Ray would take the footage of his Gwangi model and they would put it over the Jeep. And I'm trying to remember, he actually did some work to make the ropes look better. He colored the ropes, so that they would stand out. Well, so that they could be seen, although he thought they did blend in a little too much with the background. But still, he was being extra careful he was lining up his model's ropes with the ropes that were in the actual footage. I'm just like, man, I can't imagine the tedium that was. I think he said he spent 5 months on this scene alone.
And once you consider that it was 11 months, 3 weeks, like that was about half.
Almost half of his time was spent on this scene.
Which, I mean, we do get the Styracosaurus at the end here as well. Which, by the way, I do think the fact that Gwangi like bites the ropes is a smart way to write him getting out of the ropes. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I liked
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Think of here, just to put this into perspective, the roping scene is about 4.5 minutes, 5 months.
Yeah.
Yeah. He had to animate the ropes frame by frame to stay in line. It was filmed in split screen. And he says he wished he had made the ropes white so they would have stood out better from the background. And Ray also acted out on set and coached the actors.
That part's wild.
That is wild.
Another wild thing that happens in this scene is Carlos stabs the Styracosaurus for no reason. I really don't understand why some of the stuff in this movie happens.
Basically, spectacle.
I guess.
I would say.
Carlos ends up dying here too. He gets eaten.
Yeah, which gets acknowledged briefly later, but then they don't really do anything with it.
Again, yeah. So, and this is the thing, like, we're an hour and roughly 9 minutes into the film. So, Carlos dies.
We forgot to mention that when Gwangi shows up in this, there's this nice little detail, and this is what really makes Ray's animation stand out from his competition. And that is, because he didn't have to do this, when Gwangi comes on screen, he scratches his nose. Little things like that make his animation unique.
And I think that's one reason why Ray is such an amazing stop motion animator. He is very like prone to detail. He focuses on everything. I know, like, he talked about, like, he animates everything, like every limb individually, but it's all in a sequence. So everything's so fluid and it looks and feels natural.
Mm-hmm.
He really knew how to bring natural elements to his films.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, back to the Styracosaurus getting stabbed.
Yeah, so the Styracosaurus gets stabbed. Gwangi continues to fight it, eventually leaving it for dead, going and killing Carlos. As
it was a pretty gory death too.
Yeah, it was kind of gruesome. Which I guess this is a good enough point to bring it up. This was Ray Harryhausen's first G-rated movie. All of his previous films were all rated, but this one's G. For
Oh yeah, all rated. Yeah, this is when the MPA. Well, it's now the MPA, but back then it was the MPAA. This is when their rating system had started.
Right. But I bring up that rating because I think that impacted a certain element of this film that I will bring up later on.
Okay.
So our cowboys escape. Gwangi gets stuck in the cavern, which this, again, King Kong, like Kong got...
Yeah, except in Kong, they knocked him out with the gas bombs.
Yeah, this he just kind of falls down.
In this one, he gets captured by accident.
Right.
It's kind of anticlimactic, to be honest. I mean, yeah, you could argue that they led him there, but not a fan.
Yeah. And also the knocked out cold dinosaur model and the life-size like head that they used to wrap the rope around looks atrocious.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, Ray himself said he was disappointed with this scene. He had wished that he had the budget to build a larger, more articulated model for it.
And like the whole like idea of like the dinosaur gets knocked out cold by the rocks, like it works, but also it just looks really stupid.
It does. I will say this: I took umbrage with one of the authors I looked at when talking about this scene. I hate it when people do this. He described the scene as having less life, quote, than the worst Godzilla, end quote.
Really?
Yeah. I was a little perturbed when I read that.
Interesting. I don't really have a comment on that. That's just an interesting statement.
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, our heroes beat Gwangi by accident. Heck, I even said they really don't do anything other than just lead him there. And then the scene ends with someone saying, Where's Carlos? And then we fade out and forget about him.
Right, and then we get a really campy scene where like they've built this pen around Gwangi,
Which
and
this is different than Kong. In the original King Kong, they skip the trip
right
back to the island. So we don't know how they got Kong back. We just know they got Kong back, which is the interesting thing about the subsequent movies, the Toho movies, the remakes. They actually address this and show us a traveling scene.
They kind of pull a Dracula in King Kong. Like, you don't see how Dracula gets to London, but they kind of just explain it and move on with the whole Demeter.
Yeah. So we get this scene where they're traveling back. They got Gwangi in a cage, which Ray said was difficult to animate because he had to get around the cage to get to the model. So from a technical standpoint, this is impressive. But we get another little confrontation between Bromley and Tia. Oh, how dare you bring Gwangi here, blah, blah, blah. Oh, science, science, science. And, it's like, okay, we get it. Moving on.
Yeah.
And then we get to the ending. We're back to the rodeo. We have this big old, looks like a circus tent. It's got a sign on it that says Gwangi the Great, but nobody can see it. But they're hyping this, like nothing you've ever seen before. Come see Gwangi the Great, sort of a thing. It's Kong's name. It's King Kong's name up in lights in New York on Broadway. That sort of a thing. This is so we're getting
Joe of Africa.
It's more of the Kong vibes are coming back here now. This actually might be one of the strong. If you thought the stuff in the Valley had strong Kong vibes, we got even stronger ones here, I would say.
Yeah.
The main difference, I did read something where somebody pointed out there is an interesting parallel and difference here, because not only the setting, but this is we're going from the heart of a city to the outskirts, of a Wild West show, but both end up with the same result: death and destruction. Because somebody brought something from nature, from the wild, to quote-unquote civilization. And in both instances, something unique is destroyed as a result of human selfishness and avarice.
But this movie, undermines it so much more.
A bit.
Honestly, this feels more akin to, Gorgo with the Rampage.
A little bit. I can see that.
In the city, they're hyping up Gwangi. The professor is trying to fight TJ and Tuck about Gwangi being used as a show animal. Instead, he wants it to be used for science. And they just kind of are like, yeah, you can do it on the time we provide it to you. And he gets angry and storms off, which this is basically it for him. We have about 20 minutes left of this movie, and he becomes completely irrelevant. And all of our other characters have basically become irrelevant besides Tuck and TJ, which would work if it wasn't for the fact that Tuck and TJ kind of suck as characters, especially with their total reversal of roles.
Yeah. Now, I did read an article that argued that this movie tries to demythologize its characters, because that was more in keeping with Westerns of the 60s. Trying to demythologize these Western characters. They're much less larger than life, more grounded, kind of cynical, whereas the older Westerns of the 40s and 50s especially were presenting them as these larger than life figures. Seems like a polite way of saying that the characters are just kind of okay.
Right.
So they have some more back and forth, and she gets called out. I was like, why are you suddenly interested in keeping the rodeo going? I thought, what happened to going to Wyoming where nobody lives?
Right.
And then we get to the midget sneaking in to let Gwangi loose again, because this is a good idea.
Right. While he's doing this, we have the elephant that's, doing tricks for all the audiences, which Harryhausen wanted to get a living
a
elephant?
real elephant, a 15-foot elephant. Little did he know that the tallest elephant in the world at this point was 13 feet.
So
But
that didn't work out. It
Yeah,
ended
so
up being
their prop guy, was it their prop guy? He kept saying, "Are you going to get us the real elephant or not?" It's like, "Oh, it's coming," and Ray would say, "Yeah, so is Christmas," which I thought was funny. Yeah,
But no, we're intercut between basically 4 things.
yeah, it was the production manager.
Gotcha. We have the professor that's standing and watching. We have the leader of the rodeo doing his announcing. We have the audience watching, and then we have our guy unleashing Gwangi. But he only really unleashes one, or he unties one of the bolts before he gets chowed down on. Which,
Yeah. And I will admit, they're pulling up this rodeo's got a bunch of money if they can do this tent. So they're doing this dramatic reveal where they're pulling up the tent, and the first thing everybody sees is Gwangi eating a guy.
yeah.
No wonder everyone would freak out.
And so everybody kind of starts to be terrified and they run away. Gwangi starts to like break down the cage, and so the professor runs out and then gets squashed by the cage. Like, it's such a really unceremonious death. It's like, okay.
Yeah?
Whatever.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I also forgot to mention that the whole plot with TJ and Tuck gets resolved in a silent wide shot, and they just kiss, and then, story's over. That plot's over with. Yeah. But yeah, Bromley just gets crushed by the cage, and I'm just like, well, you're the world's dumbest smart guy.
Yeah. Gwangi fights the elephant, just like
what is with
Strachosaurus.
elephant abuse in Ray Harryhausen movies? This happened at 20 billion miles to Earth too. He had a thing for pitting monsters against elephants.
Must have been something he was packing in his trunks.
Badum-tish? It was pachyderming? That's what I thought you were going for. All right.
Well, it was a Tusk joke to make,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but also I did write in the notes like, Gwangi goes straight for the throat. No wonder the gypsies think he's evil. But that's also just how predators hunt. They go, they go for the throat. It just makes sense.
And so basically, the last
although Gwangi does politely put a dead guy down.
This is true. There's a lot of deaths in this last
10
minutes. And I the last up until about the last minute of the movie. Basically, we have a 10-minute rampage sequence where people are running in terror, going to a church as Gwangi attacks.
Yeah, and he's snapping at people, he's roaring at people. By the way, the Gwangi roar was the modified sound of a camel slobbering. And once I read that, I couldn't unhear it.
One thing. No, go ahead.
I was just saying, and the jaws, because he's snapping at people, the jaws was 2 pieces of wood that were being clapped together.
Really?
And once I read that, I can't unhear it.
Yeah. What? Okay. Were you surprised by how many extras they were able to get for this?
That is an impressive amount of extras, but I think a lot of them were locals, I would guess.
I would assume that they did a whole thing at wherever they were filming at.
Yeah, a little bit.
If you come down.
Yeah, a little bit like Gareth Edwards when he was making monsters. He just talked the locals into being in the movie.
And I do love the idea of the final part of this film. The last 5 minutes or 6 minutes here is all in this church. This church
I love
that's
it.
Large enough that a dinosaur can come in and they have to hide. That's a really cool okay, in Jurassic World Dominion or Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, where in Fallen Kingdom it ends in this giant mansion. It's kind of lame, but the fact that this is a giant church and at one point Tuck falls onto the organ. Stuff like that's really cool. Yeah, I really like this.
Yeah, they're taking advantage of the environment as a set piece, and it's really atmospheric. It's interesting because we're seeing this monster invading a sacred space. And I have this quotation here from Ray where he talked about this. He said, quote, "I have always felt that the stalking of the humans in the cold echoing church is very atmospheric, suggesting the sacred and the profane," end quote. That is directly from his book.
And see, I feel like the fact that, I mean, because what happens is Tuck throws this fire at Gwangi, and somehow the whole cathedral that's built out of stone bursts into flames.
Yeah.
I almost feel like the flames...
in their defense, Notre Dame caught fire a few years ago.
Oh, that's true. But, like, there's a couple things here. One, I felt like this was a lot like Mighty Joe, because at the end of Mighty Joe, there is a random fiery orphanage.
Yes. And it switches to... They switch on the red color filter.
Yeah. So here again, we get a, fiery inferno in a big building. And on top of that, I almost wondered, like, the fact that they give Gwangi kind of this, like, devilish, like, undertone. The whole idea of, like, Gwangi's burning in this church could be interpreted somewhat like that. Because, like, eventually, like, this church, like, burns.
Yeah.
It's really cool. I love the lighting. I love all of it. It is kind of sad. Like, it's such an abrupt way to, like, burn and kill Gwangi.
And they really drag it out, too. And
Yeah.
he is making horrendous noises.
And
It's almost like the filmmakers want you to feel sorry for him, even though you don't really have a reason to. It's not like Kong, where there's a level of pity that can be had for Kong.
See, I almost wonder if they are trying to, because we get a close-up of our kid character, and he's, like, crying. Pepe. Lope. He's crying. So it's like, okay, is he, like, sad about Gwangi? Like, why is he crying?
Yeah.
So I can't help but think that perhaps there was a scrapped story element to, like, really give Gwangi this tragic background. And that got cut because it is like a Kong knockoff. Not knockoff, but Kong bloodline. Yeah. I don't know. But
descendant?
Yeah.
Actually, I think you can say that, because this was originally a Willis O'Brien idea. So yes, it is a Kong descendant.
And then as the church goes up in flames, we get our end credits.
Yeah, well, I do have a note about the cathedral that I wrote with that, because the cathedral collapses as it's burning. And I wrote, science and the supernatural clash in a place of worship, and both are destroyed.
I think there's something profound in that.
Yeah. Because, Gwangi, the natural thing, and then the church is a place of worship. It is a supernatural place. And then they both, and we've already seen the conflict between science and, we'll say, superstition throughout this movie. And then they clash in this place, and then it leads to fire and destruction. Interesting thought. But what were you saying about the credits?
Oh, I was just going to point out, just like in Mighty Joe Young, we do get the monster credited.
Yes. It's cute.
Gwangi is himself.
Yeah.
And Gwangi. I think it's just and Gwangi.
And Gwangi as himself. Yeah. It's cute.
So, out of curiosity, Nathan, and maybe you know something that I don't know, Rex suggested that Mighty Joe, which was released in 1949, is the first time a monster got its own credits. Monster in air quotes. Joe's not really a monster, but a creature.
Yeah.
Creature got his own credits.
Unless you want to count the actors who played Dracula, you want to count Bela Lugosi or...
No, I mean, because in Godzilla King of the Monsters, they say Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah as himself.
Yeah.
They do that in I think they do that in GMK as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it might be the first time that happened. I can't think of any instance before that.
Unless it's in King Kong, Son of Kong, or Lost World, I think
it's not.
It might be the first time.
It might be the first time, because I don't remember Kong being credited as himself. And I certainly don't remember Kiko being credited as himself.
Right.
So yeah, might be the first time. Godzilla certainly wasn't. They didn't even credit the suit actors until the 70s.
Right. But with that being said, Nathan, that's
Valley of Gwangi.
that's the Valley of Gwangi. Now, there's a couple ways we can go about this. We can do our final thoughts on the film. We can go into the release of the film. We can go into the cast and crew.
Let's do the release, and then we'll do final thoughts.
So, just like Mighty Joe Young, Valley of Gwangi did not do well. It failed.
No.
And
did you say just like Mighty Joe Young?
Yes, Mighty Joe Young failed, and so did Valley of Gwangi.
Yeah.
Which, and this is the thing, the fact, I think these films wouldn't have suffered as much if it wasn't for the fact that they're Kong lineage. Like, Kong was huge.
Yeah.
And all of its descendants, starting with Son of Kong, and then Mighty Joe, and then Gwangi. Well, King Kong versus doesn't count, but you know what I'm trying to say here. Like, the Kong descendants produced in America did not perform like they should have.
Mm-hmm.
And I guarantee you, if Gwangi had done better, Harryhausen would have done way more.
Yeah. This movie's failure was his motivation for getting back to his roots and doing the fantasy movies.
Now, Ray specifically, I believe, blamed Warner Brothers due to their shift of management.
Yeah.
They decided to not market this film because monster movies weren't really popular anymore.
Nope.
And because of the marketing changes, he thinks that the film ended up failing. Now, they did end up re-releasing the film in 1971. It was double billed with When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
But
which is a much more appropriate double feature than what it was the first time, because Ray complained in his book, is like, they put it on a double bill with forgettable movies like Girl on a Motorcycle and The Good Guys and the Bad Guys and Seven Golden Men. And it was the second movie on this double feature with all of those, apparently. And I'm like, well, that makes sense, because I've never even heard of any of these movies, but I know about Gwangi.
Mm-hmm.
Funny how that works.
Yeah.
So it was probably a multitude of factors. It should have been released sooner, to capitalize on the popularity of Westerns and monster movies. Poor marketing, the change in management, the fact that Warner Brothers 7 Arts, that's the name of the subsidiary here, was just, was gone. Only lasted from 67 to 69. It was a multitude of factors.
And so that's really all I had on the release itself. It's really disappointing, but honestly, as you and I have kind of talked through this movie, I think it's a little more obvious where, like, this film really falls apart.
Yeah. Schneer said that the Warner Brothers didn't know how to market a movie like this, like Columbia did.
Right. So,
yeah, it's unfortunate. But it's become a cult classic since then. That's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Time has been kind to Gwangi.
But will it be kind to our final thoughts and ranking?
Well, we'll find out, won't we? Let's get into that. So what are your final thoughts, Mr. Elijah, on the Valley of Gwangi?
Perhaps it's just the fact that, like, I'm aware of the background of this movie, and I just watched Mighty Joe Young less than 72 hours ago. The Valley of Gwangi is 100% an offspring of King Kong. It's really sad to see that a bulk of Willis O'Brien's legacy ended up being stuff like Son of Kong, Mighty Joe Young, and The Valley of Gwangi, because it's all hereditary to his biggest hits. It's kind of disappointing in that regards. Gwangi has a lot of fun aspects. Like, it definitely makes sense that it's a cult classic. It's not the first, and really anyway, but it does moderately well with what it has. And really and honestly, I think my biggest issues with this film end up being the bloated cast without the lack of any development. And there's a lot of long moments in this film that really drag out. And during this discussion, I honestly, to add on to that, I think these various subplots that get nothing resolved and go nowhere, I think is another big issue with this film. And I think at certain points, this movie does become a little boring. and I think that's probably its biggest problem. The abrupt fire at the very end really does feel like it's trying to just finish off Gwangi in the most traumatic, horrendous way without really much buildup. That being said, I think overall, while it is a basic dinosaur and monster on the loose type of movie, I think at the end of it, I was content with what I watched. I didn't feel like I was wasting many time. I feel like I was engaged enough that, yes, I did check the runtime throughout my viewing here, but it wasn't really. I wasn't like, oh my god, how much longer? It was just more like, how much longer do we have?
Mm-hmm.
So overall, it's not the worst Ray Harryhausen movie, but it leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I have a lot of similar thoughts as you. It's almost the opposite problem, because I listened a little bit to last year's episode, and I actually said that, with Golden Voyage of Sinbad, one of the things that helped prop that up was actually the stuff outside of the Ray Harryhausen special effects, where I feel like here you come for the Ray Harryhausen special effects and for the concept of cowboys and dinosaurs. The problem is that it doesn't live up to all of its potential with that concept. Even with the Kong cloning that it does, it's really only, like I said, the very basic structure. It's King Kong with very different skin. Instead of an ape, it's a dinosaur. Instead of a movie director, it's a rodeo. Instead of an island, it's a hidden valley. And I don't mean the ranch dressing. Things like that. So it's not that it can't work. It can work. It's just that the script is undercooked and the characters needed a bit more development. I don't know if better actors would have helped to elevate things. It might have.
I think they need to consolidate and
eliminating a few characters probably would have been a good idea. Really zero in on TJ and Tuck if that's what you want to do. I would have put more emphasis on the conflict between tradition and, I guess you could say, like TJ's independence, how she's torn between those. And also put a bit more emphasis on the conflict between science and the supernatural. I would say in this, if you're going to introduce Bromley, if he's not in the original script and you want a science character to provide a little bit of humor and a groundedness, then really lean into it. And they don't. The big draw, like I said, are the effects in this. And Ray said it was some of his best work. And I can see why he would say that. There's some fantastic stuff to be had in here, but it's no King Kong.
Right.
But does it have to be? Not necessarily. It failed at the box office for various reasons, but it's been rediscovered since then and developed a cult following. Although I'm going to be honest with you, if it wasn't for the fact that these effects were done by Harryhausen, I don't know if it would have acquired the following that it did. It might have ended up...
I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, it might have ended up more like Dinosaurus, where, that has stop motion effects and it clearly inspired by Harryhausen, but they were not done by Harryhausen.
Right.
And so they aren't nearly as good. Now, Dinosaurus is noteworthy for some other things. It's got its own quirks that make it notable, but the effects are not one of them. So, yeah. Not the worst, not the best either, even in our own coverage. Let's do the ranking, and then we'll do cast and crew and start wrapping things up. What do you think?
Yeah, let's do it. Now,
All right.
Before we do the ranking, just for anybody listening, last year we covered Golden Voyage of Sinbad, Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, and Clash of the Titans.
Yes.
This year, not only will we be doing the Valley of Gwangi, but because we both have covered Mighty Joe Young, we're going to add that into our rankings as well. So we will not have 4 this year, we will have 5.
Yes.
And so, Nathan, I guess I'll start us off at my number 5, which is Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. I think that's the only film I actively was bored in throughout a bulk of the movie in terms of Ray Harryhausen movies.
And that is my number 5 as well.
What's your number 4?
My number 4, I will admit I debated a little bit back and forth with this, but I went with Golden Voyage of Sinbad.
Okay. That's fair. I went with Mighty Joe Young. I was really bored with not really bored, but like there were various points where I was like, okay, this just feels like King Kong, but underdeveloped. The whole orphanage scene at the very, like, that sequence.
It does kind of come out of nowhere. The animation's great, but the abrupt shift to the red filter and it's, I mean, when I did my episode on it, my guests on that were so flabbergasted by that sudden shift that was the first thing we were talking about because they're like, well, you need to talk about the ending.
And I mean, at the end of the day, I think the best thing about that film is the animation and Robert Armstrong being Robert Armstrong.
Oh, yeah.
But even then, I think the characters in Mighty Joe Young just don't really tackle or really leave the same like imprint that the characters from King Kong do. And there's the whole like pedophilic aspect of like the love story of that movie. Yeah, no, I'm good.
You're good.
I'm good.
You're good.
Even though she technically should be 19 and we're saying that she's not. It's weird. But still, it's a minor getting kissed by a guy that's like 10 years older than her. It's fine.
Yeah. All right, number 3.
For me, it's The Golden Voyage of... my number 3, I had this written differently, but during our discussion, I decided to move it. Number 3 for me is The Valley of Gwangi.
Ah, my number 3 is also Valley of Gwangi.
Interesting. So, I'll jump in here real quick. The reason I put Valley of Gwangi above Mighty Joe Young might simply be because I like dinosaurs more so than I do apes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I am a Godzilla fan before a Kong fan any day of the week. Both of them have very similar stories, but I like seeing a T-Rex rampage a city over a gorilla fighting lions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of it just comes down to my own stylistic choice and my bias. But I also think that the characters in Gwangi, while not as well portrayed, are a little bit better than the lacking characters of Jill and O'Hara and all of them from Mighty Joe Young.
Yeah.
Also, everybody in Mighty Joe Young can be found in King Kong 10 times better.
Yeah. I had Gwangi above Golden Voyage, largely because, as we discussed in last year's episode, even though there are some impressive sequences in Golden Voyage, most of it is stuff that we've already seen and done a bit better. You know, there's a skeleton fight in Golden Voyage of Sinbad. That's cool, except we've seen that in Jason and the Argonauts. You know, it's another Sinbad movie. Well, we've seen that one before. We had Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. You know, the most impressive thing in it is probably the dancing goddess.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but that's one really outstanding sequence amidst a bunch of stuff that, while good, we've seen before.
Right.
So, you know, that's why I rank Gwangi higher, because we're seeing this becomes a cult classic and an influential movie, as we talked about. And it's arguably the best animation that Ray does for dinosaurs. Or at the very, you know, especially, I mean, he says that the El Diablo is some of the best animation he's done for animals. So, you know, so there's that I'm including with this. And while the characters are kind of undercooked, I did enjoy some of their interactions and things like that. So that's why I rank it higher, because there's more. While I do think the non-special effects portions of Golden Voyage are better than this one, I think the special effects in this are more memorable overall than what we got in Golden Voyage, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
see,
that one's probably a little bit close. I debated a little bit. The middle section of this I had some debate over, but I knew what I wanted for number 1, and I knew what I wanted for number 5 for sure.
And see, for me, like the Golden Voyage, that's my number 2. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact I'd rather have a Harryhausen highlight reel than a undercooked story.
Right.
There's a lot of things about Golden Voyage that like have been done better, right? But Golden Voyage is more middle of the road, whereas Gwangi does have high points, but it also has low points. So it's a little more sporadic throughout the film and various aspects on what's good and what's not. The stop motion is good, but the narrative is lacking.
Mm-hmm.
The on-location stuff's good, but the editing leaves a lot to be desired at points, whether it's the compositing or the sound mixing or whatever. So Golden Voyage is just a lot more of a consistent film, and that's why I rank Golden Voyage above Gwangi.
Mm-hmm. My number 2 is our big disagreement for this list.
You put Mighty Joe.
I have Mighty Joe.
You're a weird person.
A big part of why I do that is
sad, strange little man.
Yes, I'm a sad, strange little man. But the big reason why I have Mighty Joe at number 2 is this is the one time the original master and the new master worked together on a project. Now, Ray did more work than Obi did, but still, they worked on this together. And Joe is a fantastic character, and I love the idea of this being an inversion of King Kong, where, yes, it's another big ape movie, but the ape is specifically meant to be sympathetic, and he's supposed to be the hero and not this tragic figure. You know, it ends happily and things like that. Jill is the opposite of Anne, where she's actually sympathetic toward him and, you know, and things like that. The effects in this paved the way for Gwangi. So that's why I had to put it above Gwangi, because there are sequences that are very much taken from Mighty Joe and emulated later. Arguably better, or more impressively, I guess would be a better way to put it, than Mighty, later, but this came first. Now, is Mighty Joe as good as King Kong? No. But it's hard to be as good as King Kong.
Right. It's definitely a high bar. And speaking of high bars, Nathan, what's your number 1?
Clash of the Titans.
Booyah. Me too.
Clash of the Titans. I went a little bit back and forth about it, but the more I thought about it, I'm like, this is the grand finale. Like it was the first truly big budget. It took all the way till the end of his career, but Ray finally got a proper big budget to play with, and that
you can't beat the Kraken.
The Kraken, and so he goes out on a high note. And Medusa, my gosh, Medusa is absolutely fantastic. Probably what?
Cerberus, the multi-headed dog.
Oh, yeah. But the Medusa with all the tinier heads crawling around on her, I'm just like, the patience that was required to make that work. Medusa is one of Ray's greatest creations.
Yeah.
So,
and that's Valley of Gwangi.
That's Valley of Gwangi.
Cast and crew?
Yeah. Go for it.
All right. Starting with our cast, we have James Franciscus as Tuck Kirby. Franciscus as Tuck Kirby, who was in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Killer Fish, The Last Shark, and an episode or 2 of The Twilight Zone. Gila Golan as TJ. Didn't have any other film roles related to this genre. Richard Carlson as Champ was in The Ghost Breakers, Hold That Ghost, The Amazing Mr. X, The Magnetic Monster, It Came From Outer Space, Riders to the Stars, and Men into Space. Lawrence Naismith as Professor Bromley was in Village of the Damned, Jason and the Argonauts, Eye of the Cat, and some episodes of this TV show The Invaders. Frida Jackson as Tia Zorina was in The Brides of Dracula, Die Monster Die, and Clash of the Titans.
Which Die Monster Die also had Nick Adams.
Mm-hmm. You had Curtis Arden as Lope and Gustavo Rojo as Carlos. Your crew, starting with Jim O'Connelly as your director, was an assistant director on the 1954 film Child's Play, a production manager on The Atomic Man, production manager on Horrors of the Black Museum, an associate producer on Conga.
Oh,
the
no.
writer, yeah, the writer of Blood Beast from Outer Space, and writer and director of Tower of Evil.
Oh.
William Bast, as your co-writer, worked on The Outer Limits, Deadly Invasion, The Killer Bee Nightmare. Julian Moore was your co-writer, who worked on Incense for the Damned. The story was by Willis O'Brien, who worked on the films such as The Lost World, King Kong, Son of Kong, She, Mighty Joe Young, The Animal World, The Beast of Hollow Mountain, The Black Scorpion, The Giant Behemoth, and the 1960 remake of The Lost World. Charles H. Schneer, the producer, worked on It Came... Schneer. I'll get it eventually. Worked on It Came From Beneath the Sea, 20 Million Miles to Earth, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, The Three Worlds of Gulliver, Mysterious Island, Jason and the Argonauts, First Men in the Moon, The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, and Clash of the Titans. Your composer was Jerome Morris. He actually reused music from his film The Big Country on this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, your associate producer and effects was by Ray Harryhausen, which need I list off that man's credits that I haven't talked about already, or you, in that matter.
Yeah.
Nathan.
There's a lot we got a lot more to get into.
And that's it. Another Monster Conversation Annual under the belt. We are officially in the 1960s, arguably the best decade for Ray Harryhausen. We'll see as we continue to journey on into other films made prior to this one.
Yep. And in fact, next year, as we've already mentioned, we'll be getting into some more dinosaurs, and it's going to be, I think, depending on how things shake out, it may be only the second Hammer movie I've ever covered on the show.
And that'll be when we go back 1 million years BC.
With Raquel Welch in prehistoric bikinis. Also dinosaurs.
Big dinosaurs.
Big dinosaurs. Really big dinosaurs.
And cavemen.
And cavemen.
Is dialogue? I don't remember dialogue.
I don't remember dialogue either. But we'll find out. We'll see next year when we revisit it. Well, really quick, since we'll start wrapping things up here. I do want to mention really quick, thank you to all of MIFE's lovely MIFE Max members on Patreon for sponsoring this and many other episodes here on the Film Vault. Your contributions are greatly appreciated. I do not take that for granted whatsoever. And I think we can just start getting into, our shameless self-promotion. What do you say?
Sounds good to me.
All right. So for me, you'll listen to the credits because you should always listen to the credits. So you can get information on how to contact us to send us listener feedback or join MIFE Max on Patreon for as little as $3 a month to get lovely perks like early access and bonus audio and an exclusive monthly podcast / live stream. You can also check out my sister podcast, Henshin Power V3, where three friends have 3 minutes to talk about Tokusatsu. I co-host that with Christopher Reiner and Jake Hambrick, a.k.a. Sentai Guy and The Metal Don, respectively. If you're into Henshin Hero television, whether it be animated or live action, give that one a listen. Our funny little gimmick is that we only get 3 minutes to talk about each episode of television that we talk about. Also, check out my author website, nathanjsmarchand.com, where you can learn about all of my books, including some kaiju-related books, such as my novella Destroyer, which I co-wrote with Natasha Hayden and Timothy Deal, and this is very important for you and me, Elijah, the Rondo Award-nominated Giant Bug Cinema, which we both contributed to, which is a collection of essays about movies featuring giant insects. I came onto the project late, so I was stuck writing about Monster from Green Hell because no one else wanted it. Giant wasps in Africa in the 1950s. I guess I could do worse. But this mother trucker got to write about Ghidorah the three-headed monster.
This is true.
I'm not jealous. I swear. Nope. Anyway, I'm also a contributing writer to Kaiju United, where I usually write about book reviews, comics, and all that. However, and I will include a link in the at least my show's show notes for this. I wrote an article where I visited the Harryhausen exhibit up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, while it was there. And for what I've been told, it's been a very popular article. Got some great pictures and a little video montage from Nick Adam. Not Nick Adams, but Nick Adam of the Monster Report. So go give that a read. And then finally, I am part of the stable of actors for Scyther Inc. Productions. For their audio dramas, you can hear me as, of all people, Deadpool on X-Men the audio drama, and infamously as Rito Bandora on Power Rangers the audio drama, and as Johnny Storm, baby, on Avengers the audio drama when they cross over with the Fantastic Four. In fact, we had a one-shot solo adventure for the Fantastic Four published just this past May. So, that's all my stuff. What do you have, Elijah?
Well, first I want to say hello. I'm Elijah, and I have a kaiju and tokusatsu problem.
Hi, Elijah.
Joking aside, I am Elijah Thomas. I am the co-host of the podcast Kaiju Conversation with my good friend Rex. If you're listening to my version of this, then you already know that, but if you're not, go check it out. We cover the wide world of tokusatsu, from kaiju and giant monsters to henshin heroes and J-horror. You can find us on any podcast platform you use, and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Kaiju_Converse on all of those sites. I'm also a writer. I've written for GodzillaMovies.com, Kaiju Ramen Magazine, Kaiju United, and my writing has also been featured in the book Giant Bug Cinema, a Monster Kid's Guide from Bear Manor Media, where I indeed wrote about Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. I have also have been given the privilege to work with my good friends at Giant Monster BS on their second season as a creative consultant, covering independent kaiju films on their podcast. Outside of writing and podcasting, I also served as a consultant on the Titanic Creations Youngari figure. Go to titanicreations.com/Youngari to order yours today. I have also been given the privilege to produce bonus features for SRS Cinema. I have worked on Yuzo, The Biggest Battle in Tokyo, Liverleaf, War of the Ninja Monsters, Jiron vs. Gora, Hoshi 35, Outer Man, and a long list of movies coming soon. You can order all of these Blu-rays on srscinema.com. I'm also a filmmaker and YouTuber. You can check out my stuff on my YouTube channel, ET13 Productions, where you can see some of my short films and my old YouTube videos, along with the ever-growing playlist that features all of my appearances on YouTube. I do plan on getting some new videos out soon, so definitely check that out. You can check out my action figure photography on my Instagram at ET13_Productions, and my ex, the artist formerly known as Twitter, thanks Danny, at the same handle. Thank you so much for doing this again, Nathan. It's been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed it a lot, and I couldn't think of anybody else better to do this with every year.
Yeah, well, good luck fighting another kaiju podcaster who has the same birthday as you and Ray Harryhausen.
This is true. That's probably 1 in a million.
Oh, it's got to be. But is
maybe
it
20 million?
Or 1 in a million years? Ooh,
I could maybe journey to beneath the sea and see if I could locate something.
Oh, I see what you did there. Mighty Joe Elijah. Oh.
You know, I got to travel 20,000 fathoms to really find anything, but perhaps after I do, I can find something on a mysterious island somehow.
Oh, but that'll be after you take a 7th golden voyage to go find the Eye of the Tiger. Oh.
And then, after it's all said and done, it'll be a clash of the real titans,
Oh, yeah. And I'm sure you'll be able to find Gulliver while you're there too. Yeah.
Yeah. And then once Gulliver's involved, at that point, it's basically going to be Earth versus some flying saucers.
No. Yeah, on a mysterious island. Yeah.
By the time it's over, like all the carnage, it'll just become an animal world.
Oh, there you go. Okay, I think we've run this joke into the ground.
We haven't. We have two more.
We have two more. Well, and then you're going to have to take a journey with Jason and the Argonauts into the Valley of Gwangi, Just how this works. I don't make the rules.
Yep, into the Valley of Gwangi, into the mist. The valley that time forgot. And with that, we have officially ended the joke, the episode, and this year's Monster Conversation.
See you next year, folks.
Bye.
We love you, Ray.
We are set, we are in debt. There's nothing to sweat. Life's too short now, baby. And not too big now, baby. Conversation. His name's Elijah, baby. And also Rex now, baby. We love those kaiju, baby. And you will too now.